I guess we're ready to get started. People want to come in and take your seats. Let me introduce myself. My name is Joe McGee. I'm Washington representative for the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. We are a multi-campus research unit in the UC system, and we try to support policy-oriented research and do programs from time to time out here in Washington to bring the results of that research here. I have to confess I have had very little to do with this particular program up to now, but I'm very glad to have the chance to welcome you all here on behalf of IGCC and also for Bruce Kane on behalf of the UC Washington Center. I'm glad you could be here today for this conference. As I'm sure some of you know, St. Augustine as a young man was torn very much between his growing religious vocation and an equally, or if not more strong, set of raging young male hormones. In the midst of this inner conflict, he recorded in his confessions that he regularly prayed to God, Domini da mihi castitatem et contentium sed noli modo, which is more or less, God grant me chastity and freedom from lust, but not right away. And this comes to my mind because as we look now at the opinion polls here in the United States regarding climate change and the need to take action on the environment, there's a growing support for the government to do something, but equally strong uncertainty about what should be done. How's it going to affect me? What am I going to have to give up? How is my lifestyle going to change? And so I think it's a great thing that the state of California and the University of California, working with the EU in this case, is taking some steps to point the way for the rest of the country. And in that spirit, I'm very glad to see all of you here today, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Our first speaker to kick this off was supposed to have been Ambassador Bruton, the head of the EU mission here in Washington. Unfortunately, he had to go to New York today. So in his place, we're going to have the mission counselor, Malachi Hargadon, who's going to greet you on behalf of the EU mission here. Thank you very much, and have a good conference.
Thank you very much, Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a very poor substitute for the European Commission ambassador to the United States, and so I do begin by expressing his regret and disappointment to not being able to be here at this conference today. John Bruton is such a very high-profile diplomat, subject to incessant demands on his time and availability, and as just said, he's currently up in New York. I don't know exactly all the meetings that he has, but I understand one of them is with Mayor Bloomberg. But I am pleased to have this opportunity on his behalf to welcome you all here to Washington, those of you who have come from afar, especially friends from Europe, to this conference, and to express the hope that you have a useful and productive exchanges building towards the final conference next month in Brussels. The environmental issues under discussion can sometimes seem, and I think Joe was alluding to this, like a never-ending challenge to all concerned: public authorities, academic bodies, and of course industry, as we seek to improve welfare and living standards while minimizing the impacts on our natural environment. And this is particularly so with regard to biodiversity. To protect biodiversity is one of today's great challenges. Over the last few years, the European Commission has been at the forefront of what we consider to be the great challenge, the fight against climate change. This is an area where Europe has justifiably been proud of its role as a world leader. We hope to share some of that leadership in the future. And it's an area where we cannot afford to fail, but the success of what we do on climate change will also be measured by the success of our efforts in relation to stopping the loss of biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity is a global threat that is just as important as global warming. It threatens our natural environment and thus the quality of life. It also underpins our economies. So it's therefore not because of a love of nature or just a vision of our environment that we should keep biodiversity on the political agenda. The UN's Millennium Ecosystem Assessment developed the idea of ecosystem services, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, will be very familiar with it. And these services include the provision of goods such as food and fuel and medicines. They also have an impact on the regulation of the air we breathe, the quality of our waters, and the fertility of our soils. Indeed, our prosperity is underpinned by healthy ecosystems. In particular, in developing countries, protecting nature has an important role to play in poverty reduction. And biodiversity is of most importance to the poorest populations and communities who depend directly on the fuel, food, and clean water that it provides. And yet we all too often take these goods and services so much for granted that we can only see how important they are when they are gone, when it is too late, just as in the words of Joe Mitchell's song. For its part, the European Union is striving to improve its performance against our own target of halting biodiversity loss in Europe by the end of next year. We will not achieve that. But that is not a reason for us not to try ever more and more. Our legislation for the protection of birds and habitat and our network of protected areas are at the heart of our domestic actions in Europe. But international action is also essential, since so much of biodiversity is in countries of Africa, Asia, South America, across the world. To protect global biodiversity, there are many actions that need to be followed through the work, in particular, of the UN Convention on Biodiversity. One priority that we would particularly highlight is to develop practical measures to prevent and stop global deforestation. That is where we think international action can have the biggest and most immediate impact, not just for biodiversity, but also in the fight against climate change. Now, the fact that the United States is not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity doesn't prevent the European Union and the United States from cooperating to improve the situation. And government-to-government discussions are one way in which we do this. But there are many other ways. And this conference, sponsored, as you'll know, by the European Commission, is an example of how targeted exchanges can play a significant role in building knowledge, experience, and confidence as we face up to the challenges. So I look forward to the discussions, to hearing the reports, and on behalf of my colleagues in particular, I look forward to the results of this commendable project following the conference in Brussels next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So welcome to the conference, Managing Biosafety and Biodiversity in a Global World. And as you can see, we put EU, US, California in perspective, comparative perspectives. My name is Hedy Rees. You have heard of me a lot through emails. And I'm director at the Center on Institution and Governance at UC Berkeley. And as mentioned before, it's a culmination of a 2-year project now to enhance regulatory cooperation between the US, EU, and California on environmental issues. And this project started with the German Marshall Fund, and then we got this grant with the European Commission within the framework of the pilot program on transatlantic method for handling global challenge program. And it's a co-sponsored project with the University of Leuven, and it's the Center for Global Governance Studies, and LICOS. And LICOS is a Center for Institution and Economic Performance. So we try to build here, and you are part of it, a network of experts that should come from the academic world, from the business community, from a civil servant, EPA, to really try to go to see what would be the second phase also of this kind of project, because the Commission intends to launch a second call for project. So it's very important to have also some policy recommendation. And so I would like now to give the floor to David Vogel, who is a distinguished professor in business ethics at UC Berkeley.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add my greetings. This project actually had its origin about 3 years ago at UC Berkeley, where a group of us were looking to do some comparative work. And one of the things which had occurred to us 3 years ago was that in terms of regulatory policy innovation in the United States, it was clear that California had a particularly critical role in leadership. And in addition, there was enormous cooperation and levels of similarity and exchange between California and the European Union. So our original impetus was to sort of basically do a comparative study of how EU regulations are affecting California and the extent to which California had, in a sense, become an outpost for the Europeanization, if you will, of more aggressive environmental policies. And that sort of was our beginning basis. And then we moved on. We received some inquiries from the Commission, and they were interested in supporting a much broader project dealing with biosafety and biodiversity, and also looking at U.S.-European relations as well. So this project really began with an EU-California focus, and then moved on to incorporate a European-American focus. But I think if you look at the papers and the research that we've done, what we've really tried to do is look at both and have papers which really address not only European-American relations, but European-California relations, and then in addition, California-U.S. relations, as California application for EU membership is still pending, and there's some awkward constitutional issues that need to be resolved, which we're still negotiating on. But so as long as that the application has not yet been approved, basically California is under some constraints as a member of the United States. And one of the issues which, of course, we need to deal with is the question of how much discretion California has to enter into relations with the European Union. And this also, of course, raises some broader issues of federalism, which is what are the links and distinctions and parallels and differences between the way the discretion California has to make environmental policy within the United States and the discretion which an EU member state has to make regulatory policy within the European Union. So I think that's also an important theme. The final point I just want to mention to put it into perspective, I read a book a number of years ago in the mid-90s called Trading Up, which coined the term the California effect, which was meant to sort of talk about the ways in which California environmental regulations affected both federal regulations, strengthening them, and then ultimately affecting EU regulations. The California effect continues, but the dynamics are quite different. And what we now see, and we see in these papers, is basically Brussels does something, California does something, and then it stops. And I think an interesting thing to look at, particularly with the change in presidential administration, is the extent to which the regulations and insights and perspectives, values that California imports from Europe into the United States, to what extent they will remain in California, and to what extent they will now become have greater impact on federal policy, thus sort of completing, thus California becoming a vehicle for broader European American cooperation. So I appreciate your attendance and look forward, like you, to the papers which will cover a wide range of these kinds of issues.
My colleague, my distinguished colleague from
Good morning, everybody. As David said, we have, and Hedy said, we have been working on this together now for a couple of years. So I've seen many of you already not for the first time in the framework of this conference, so it's a great pleasure. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I also would like to emphasize that for us at the University of Leuven, although we strive toward becoming a center of excellence in academic world in Europe, it's been an extremely great privilege for us to work together with many distinguished colleagues from the University of Berkeley, and also, of course, the whole framework of the University of Berkeley in this collaborative effort. I am not going to add much to what has been said by Hedy and David. I don't want to spend more time on, because I've actually learned that I am also been appointed to chairman of the first session. So I do not want to eat into the time of my own session, and so I think I will just move into my new role immediately. If I am correct, Hedy, I am the organization is such that the presenters of the paper will speak for 30 minutes and the discussion for 15. Okay, so now it's my job as chairman to keep you on that. So I therefore want to advise or invite the presenters of the first papers to come to the stage.
I just would like to add that Dan Plissier was supposed to come, will not come because he has been appointed to the cabinet of the Governor Schwarzenegger, and so he cannot come to an academic, as he said, activity, but he's with us and he wants to have the result and to also communicate, that's what he said, to the Governor.
So the first paper will be presented, I think, jointly, if I'm correct, by Bruce Kane and Christina Reyes. Yes, if I could. Christina is a litigation associate at Simpson, Thatcher and Bartlett, but she has several degrees from the UC Berkeley, including a law degree and a political science degree. It's interesting, Bruce is, I presume, known very well to all of you because his bio is not in the list of bios, actually, so that I presume this is like... It's very modest. Okay. So, please.
Good morning. Our paper discusses why and how California can and should sign a memorandum of understanding with the European Union on environmental regulations. And when we first started this project about 2 years ago, it was in a different context, a different framework. Obviously, it was during the Bush administration, and so the motivations behind why California and the EU should sign this agreement were somewhat different. Initially, the project aims were to collaborate because there was some divergence between California and the federal government's positions on environmental issues. And so in signing this type of agreement, we hoped that the EU and California could possibly influence the federal government, put some pressure on the federal government to take action on these issues. But now under the Obama administration, there's a question of, is this still necessary? And we argue that it is for two main reasons. And the first is that it's not clear whether, even as ambitious as the Obama administration is, it's unclear whether they'll be able to carry out their aims, particularly with the economic crisis and other constraints. And more importantly, even if the administration is able to carry out their plans, California can serve as an important model, as a super regulator, to use Professor Ann Carlson's terms. That is, it can serve as an example to the federal government in carrying out some policies, and the federal government can then adapt or adopt what California implements and what they view as successful. So we focus on three primary issues in this paper. The first is, why should they sign a memorandum of understanding? What is the role that it plays? The second is it legal? What are the legal implications of signing such an agreement? And then the third is why it's still important under the current administration. So the rationale behind why the parties should sign such an agreement, there are three main reasons: public relations, to shift behavior, and to exchange information. Under public relations, California and the EU could establish a reputation as leaders in environmental issues, even more so than they already have. They could signal to other states and to the world that they're committed to these issues, and that's how they intend to act prospectively. Also, in signing this agreement, the parties could aim to pre-commit themselves to certain issues. In making a public statement and signing a public declaration, they're, in a sense, committing themselves to that action and could, if they back out, could suffer some reputational harm. And lastly, this signing an agreement could assist in exchanging information, particularly since although both are very strong on environmental issues, they are known or they have focused on some separate issues. The European Union, genetically modified foods, and California on global warming. They could exchange information on areas that they have pursued in more detail, I guess. Secondly, there's the issue of legality. Is it legal or constitutional for California and the European Union to sign such an agreement? And looking under U.S. constitutional law, there's a question of whether this would intrude on the executive's authority, exclusive authority to enter into treaties. And we argue that signing such an agreement is legal, is constitutional, because one, it's an informal agreement, it's non-binding, and secondly, it's not in clear conflict with federal policy. In the EU context, there are recently been a string of European Court of Justice cases enforcing soft law instruments or non-binding resolutions or rules. And so there might be a concern on the part of the EU that such an agreement might be found as a binding agreement under EU law. And again, we argue that this is not the case. One, because these cases are distinguishable. The cases enforcing soft law instruments under EU law, these soft law instruments are, for the most part, internal policies within a division of the EU and not memorandum of understanding or any external agreements signed with other states. And in addition, even if for some reason, although not likely, the ECJ were to find such an agreement as binding, we can include in, Bruce and I have drafted a model memorandum of understanding, and within this model we've included a limitations clause clearly indicating that the agreement will not be binding and should not be interpreted as binding. And lastly, we also discuss how these memorandum of understanding came about. California has signed some with various Canadian provinces and with the United Kingdom and Mexico. So we discuss the historical reasons behind why California has signed such agreements, and also discuss why they why it's still important for California to enter into these agreements with the European Union and with other bodies. So I'll let Bruce talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I'm now official. I have a sign as well. No, there you go. I want to pick up a little bit on the first question that Christina brought up, which is the role that California has played as a superregulator and why that question could be central to thinking about a relationship between EU and California. Really, the model that you have of California is right at the core of whether it makes sense for agreement to go forward. If you believe that California is an innovator on many of these issues, from global warming to other kinds of regulation, because it's just a one-off phenomena, that is, it's a product of unique political circumstances, a particular governor, a particular moment in time, then California doesn't look like a very good partner because they could change their mind. If you believe, on the other hand, that the model about why California is a superregulator is somehow endemically based on factors about California that are unlikely to change in the near future, then your view of a relationship would shift. So quite apart from the function that superregulators play, which is actually, unfortunately, the subject of a paper that's not being given here, which is Ann Carlson's paper, but her basic argument is that in the Clean Air Act, the superregulator played a role of basically demonstrating to people that certain technologies or certain approaches were possible without crippling the economy. But the political question is, is California a reliable partner, or is it likely to change as soon as the next election? Now, as I said, the one-off model of California would be based on the fact that Arnold Schwarzenegger was a major player in the signing of this agreement. And how did it happen? Well, it happened in a very unique set of circumstances, and that is that Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected in a recall, and then attempted in 2005 to pursue a more conservative agenda. He was advised by people who had been advisors to the previous Republican governor, Pete Wilson. So he attempted a fairly conservative agenda. That agenda was rejected in 2005. He was up for re-election in 2006, and he needed to shift gears, so to speak, and move to the left, came closer to the Democrats, who already had a bill on global warming and capping emissions, and he adopted that. And it was successful in terms of getting him reelected. He then benefited from the publicity of that. He became a national figure on global warming, even though he was driving a Hummer and had previously not been identified with such an issue. But nonetheless, he, recognizing opportunity when it knocked on his door, let opportunity in the door. So that would be an argument that says this was one-off, and that California, therefore, is a rather flaky partner for any kind of negotiations, because, after all, Arnold is termed out, and we don't know who is going to replace, whether it will be a Democrat or whether a Republican, whether it will be a business-oriented person, whether it will be a more environmentally oriented person. And so that would argue that there's no real firm basis for EU-California cooperation. And moreover, that the real action now has shifted to Washington, D.C., just as the locus of this conference has, and that therefore ignore California. They are going to drift off in their idiosyncratic direction. We don't know what direction that is, but ignore them, okay? So that would be the one-off model of California. The other model would be a model of California that says, no, there's something systematic to its madness, that it chooses to be a super regulator for systematic reasons. And for those systematic reasons, you can count on a more regular commitment to a super regulatory position. And what would be some of those reasons? And again, a lot of this is covered in Ann Carlson's paper as well. First of all, there is an institutional basis to it. That is to say that California, more than any other state, has a user-friendly direct democracy system. That is to say that about half the states have some form of direct democracy, but among those, only a small fraction of them have the most user-friendly part of that, which is the popular initiative process, which allows for groups to independently go out and, with an expenditure of about $1 million, get almost anything on the ballot. If you wanted to make Santa Claus president, you could get it on the ballot in California. There is no restriction. So the low legal threshold for the initiative process lets things bubble up, both good and bad, right? And so that means that ideas about environmentalism can bubble up a lot faster, whereas the legislative filter delays things, sometimes for good purpose and sometimes for bad. It delays things because it has to go through a committee process. It delays things because interest groups have much more ability to amend and to lobby when things go to the legislature, whereas in the initiative process, things are done in a back room somewhere by a group that hires a lawyer and has an idea. So that has good and bad features to it, but one of the features is it's less amenable to business interests and others who might want to say, well, slow down, wait a minute, this is going to cost too much. So part of the willingness and acceptance of a kind of environmental stance comes from the institutional openness that's built into the direct democracy process. The second part of it is geographic, and I don't want to sound like a determinist, but there's definitely a geographic basis, and this is covered in Ann Carlson's paper, to our interest in clean air, for example. That California in certain sections, particularly in Southern California, but increasingly in the Central Valley as well, has a particular geographic construction that makes possible the production of smog in great amounts. And that early experience of smog combined with a particular economy that was very car-oriented, got away from mass transportation very early, and Los Angeles got rid of its mass transportation system, became a car culture, partly because the interest groups that were in California on behalf of the oil companies and the car companies. That volatile mixture produced a situation where California had to deal with smog starting in the 60s and 50s and 60s, which was part of the background of the negotiations over the Clean Air Act and the exemption for California. So there's a geographic component to it, and then thirdly, there's a demographic component to it, which is that California's economy drifted away from high manufacture and towards service and white-collar work. And as a result, became kind of like a Massachusetts effect. That is, you had concentrations of highly educated white-collar workers in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, and many of them living on coastal areas, and developed a taste for higher standard of living and cleaner air, et cetera. So these three factors come together to produce a kind of systematic push in California towards a higher level of environmental awareness, and led to the signing of this bill capping emissions prior to 2006. Now, the implication of that, if you buy the second model, that there's something more systematic, is that California is not just a flaky partner that's likely to go away with the next election, but rather it does have a commitment that is, it might be modified somewhat because of the severe economic downturn, but and that may affect the rate at which it moves in this direction. But the commitment itself, the direction itself, is more or less predictable and fixed. Now, Christina mentioned what some functions of a superregulator role might be, and again, it changes somewhat with the political context nationally, and I'm just going to briefly go over them and put little labels on them just because it makes it a little easier to talk about. But it seems to be the function of the agreement when it was signed, that when Arnold went ahead and signed a bunch of agreements with other Canadian provinces and with the Mexican government, was more symbolic and more of a protest. And so it was, if you like, a statement rather than having specific policy agenda to it. It seems to me that we've moved now to the second and third functions that Christina put out, which are a demonstration function. That is, that there's value, and this is again something in Ann Carlson's paper, to having a state be a super regulator out on the lead, taking on some of the innovations and then demonstrating what the costs of those innovations are, or whether it collapses the economy or whatever, but that there's a demonstration effect that can be valuable to a country as a whole, which might be reluctant to bear those costs nationally, particularly when there are parts of the country that are in much worse shape than California. California's temporarily in a bad shape, but nobody is, I think, pessimistic about the long-term prospects of the California economy, given the technological expertise that you find both in Southern California and the Silicon Valley. So one would be a demonstration effect, bearing the early costs of innovation and demonstrating possibilities. And the other is a spurring on effect, and I want to end on that one. Yes, Barack Obama is president. Yes, Barack Obama has had a magnificent 100 days. But as almost everybody that has written about the first 100 days has suggested, the second 100 days are going to get harder because of a variety of factors. But part of it is that the issues get harder. And one of them is this whole question of cap and trade or emissions policy. First of all, you have to bear in mind that even with Arlen Specter being added to the Democratic roster, and even with the final resolution of the Senate race in Minnesota, it's not a done deal that a serious global warming bill can get through the Senate. It is not a done deal. First of all, Arlen Specter, as the papers say today, is still Arlen Specter. Whatever label you stick on him, he's an independent person. Secondly, there are a number of Democrats that come from states that are skeptical about what would happen if you move aggressively on cap and trade, or indeed other forms of regulation that might have negative trade effects. And the big debate in the United States, it's ironic, it's been both in California and in the national level, is to what degree do you adhere to majority rules, and to what degree do you adhere to supermajority rules. And in California, the irony is that we have supermajority rules for the budget, and we have majority rules for the policy. In the national government, we have majority rules for the budget and supermajority rules for everything else. Long story. But anyway, that's the irony of the situation. And at both levels, both California and in Washington, the debate is about whether or not to adhere to those supermajority rules. The argument for supermajority rules is it creates more stability in the policymaking process. The argument against supermajority rules is it basically limits the majority, the transfer of the majority preferences into policy. So it's a trade-off between stability versus responsiveness. And in both jurisdictions, whether you're talking about California or you're talking about Washington, people are ambivalent about that, seriously ambivalent about that. And where they come down on that ambivalence will make a big, will have a big effect on the ultimate policies that are produced in both the United States and in California. Second reason to be tempered in your enthusiasm about potential changes is that there are huge economic differences between the new green economy and where it's going to have positive effects. And California is ready to take advantage of the new green economy. They have invested in, they've got the scientific expertise, they've got the firms in place, they're far along the curve. It's not so obvious that Michigan or Pennsylvania, which by the way were the swing states if you were paying attention to the last election, are in the same position to benefit from these new initiatives. And that's going to have a tempering effect as the Democrats think about how to hold a coalition together. And thirdly, there is the economic recession and the concern on the part of Lot that the timing of any policies dealing with the environment have to be sensitive to where we are right now in terms of economic recovery. So all this to say, it's not clear, even though circumstances have changed, that the role of a superregulator state, if it's willing to do that, is any more diminished as a result of those changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you very much, Christina. We're going to move to the discussants. As Hedy already indicated, the first discussant could not be with us today, so I'm going to move to the second discussant, which is Andrew Manali. He's from EPA, from the Office of Policy, Economics and Innovation, and as you can see from his bio, he has a very long and wide experience in various environmental policy issues. So, Andrew.
Thank you. Let me first declare some legitimacy for talking on this. Is this working? Oh, on this subject. I am a Californian, and I tell people when people ask me, even though I've lived here in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years, when people ask me, where do you live? I will say, I live in Maryland, but I am a Californian. California is a state of mind, and I'm always in a California state of mind. And I sort of learned how to do this and feeling this way ever since I went to college. I went to college at that same college that our new Barack Obama went to. And I was asked when I arrived, what are you? And as a Californian, I had no idea what that question meant. What are you? And I said, I don't know what you mean. And then finally, the questioner said, I'm a Jew, he's an Italian, he's Irish, what are you? And I said, well, I have an Italian last name. Well, then you're Italian, but I'm not. And I said, I'm a Californian. And so I made it clear I am a Californian. And I still believe California are an evolved species. The second way that I think I have some legitimacy on this subject is that I have worked, and I think probably one of the few people, I've worked in California government, both in the bureaucracy of California. I've worked also as a consultant to the California legislature. And I've worked at the federal government. I've worked in Congress. I used to work for Senator Conrad as a legislative assistant. And I, of course, worked in the bureaucracy of Washington. So I know roughly some of the differences in how these different institutions work. And then, that's probably enough. Let me go now immediately to some of my comments. And the first thing I want to say is I like the paper. I like the paper a lot because I like anything that makes me think. And what this paper does, and in many ways confirms what I've always believed, is that California is an innovator. And I'll get to the reason why I say that in my comments. California is an innovator, and we have always seen ourselves as innovators. And one sees it in the arts, one sees it in just about every possible way. We like being ahead of the crowd, and certainly ahead of the nation. I like the way the paper actually lays out the organization of the problem. I think it does it very well. It's a step-by-step approach. It leads you to some of the reasons that come at the end as to why the cooperation can work and should occur. I like the discussion of informal legal agreements, in part because I've spent almost my entire career working on informal relationships, whether informal relationships with colleagues across other agencies or within California or elsewhere trying to solve problems. I do believe very much in the value of informal relations, and I think there is some good work done. I think at the University of Pennsylvania, people are actually examining the value, even within the federal government, importance of informal relationships in getting things done. I think that the discussion about how California and even other states benefit from such arrangements, I think that rings true from my own experience. I remember a couple years after I graduated from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, that I had worked on legislation. I just helped complete legislation in California related to food safety, pesticides, particularly safety, something, again, California's always been the leader on. And I was invited to Japan. And I found this is very interesting. I'm invited to Japan. I was asked to present to the highest levels of government in Japan, 3-day session, educating everyone as to what we were doing. And I asked, why are you asking me to do this? And the answer is they recognize as California as the leader, and that they are going to model their regulations after Californians recognizing eventually the federal government is going to follow, and they need to get ahead of the game. That was their opportunity to get ahead of the game and have a competitive advantage. It's also an opportunity to reduce risk. If you think of a state that we're all going to be experimenting, you want to experiment with a state or a government that has some track record of success at actually, addressing problems. Again, I think the discussion appears at times to be very hypothetical, but I think there are many, many examples to better, perhaps, concretely illustrate your points. And I think the paper could be improved with more of these concrete examples of how California actually, in relationships, these informal relationships, have actually benefited both parties. The value of exchanging information, I also think needs to be strengthened. There are many examples where the EU can benefit from California. When I worked in California, California was first established the birth defects registry, a valuable registry. I don't know how it is now, but I'm sure it's very far along. The federal government, as far as I know, still doesn't have a birth defects registry. And many of the databases that we try to use here at EPA are cumbersome to use, very, very difficult, whereas it's much easier, at least it's my experience, the databases and the information in California. The example, I think the paper could be improved by correcting some misleading statements. The GMO issue, for example, it's quite misleading. It's not so much Europe, and I know that from my own experiences under a German Marshall Fund fellowship to Europe, it's not so much pivoting GMOs, but really regulating GMOs, and particularly in their introduction into European Union members. The MOUs, with regard to discussion of MOUs, I thought it was the reason of why California, I think Bruce has got into this in his comments, as to why California has had to develop these MOUs with other countries. It's not just because Californians are making a statement, and it's not just under Schwarzenegger that California has been doing this for years. It has had to do that in part because, again, the uniqueness, geographic uniqueness of California, the economic uniqueness of California forces it to actually make these arrangements. It cannot wait for federal government to do so. How agriculture is a prime example of that. Pesticide safety, air quality, California has always been a leader, again, because of the uniqueness of the situation. There's a wonderful map in California state government in Sacramento you go to. It shows, one of the earliest maps of California, it shows California as an island. And that is indeed how most Californians still see California. It is an island. I really enjoyed the discussion of the legalities of MOUs. It was short and sweet, and I think just enough to actually, provide the real meat of paper. I think there needs to be more discussion as the need for the MOU between California and EU. I think make clear it's not, the paper suggests that it's an either or. You either develop these strong relationships with the federal government or with California, and I don't believe that needs to be the case. One can do both. It's my experience in working, trying to solve problems in California and going to Washington. Washington works very, very slowly. Another little quick story. When I worked in California, I worked for a state senator or assemblyman, a guy named Gray Davis. He eventually became governor, but when I worked for him, I worked with him on food safety legislation. When we went to the California legislature, the strongest argument we could use with the California legislature to get legislation passed was, if we don't do it, federal government will. Washington will. Boy, it was passed. You don't want to wait for Washington to pass something. Californians won't like it. It won't be good enough. It has a very high standard, and I think Schwarzenegger quickly learned that later on. California wants to see itself as the leader. There is, even if this administration does try to work aggressively on climate, climate is an extremely complex problem. There's no guarantee that when something is actually given to EPA, we even know what to do with it or how to move forward. It requires a skill level and staff level. The difficulty is horrendous. It's as if saying, we're going to produce a new model car, we're now going to give it to buggy makers to figure out how to produce it. It's not an easy task. There are MOUs and collaborations on what I would call big P policy issues, climate change, for example, but there's a whole distribution of P issues, everything from very, very small to middle P. And I think one needs to look at a lot of these middle P issues where collaboration could very, very much benefit. Dealing with climate change, with biodiversity, we're dealing generally with systems problems, mass balance systems problems. The science is terrible. It is very primitive. Most of are looking at a very small portion of this complexity. We don't know how to make linkages. The European Union and California and others can benefit tremendously by actually sharing experience. We have to do adaptive management. It's a question of perhaps this is the approach to go, we have no choice. We don't know a clear path ahead. Even if we do have a wonderful bill that's passed through Congress, how to actually make it work is going to be extremely difficult. Lots of work needs to be done, and I mentioned in the paper I do with Heike and with Bernhard on biodiversity measurement. How do we measure? Because if we don't know how to measure, how do we know we're making progress? Paper mentions the legislative hurdles for the governments, for the federal government. An example of climate, there are again many implementational issues that need to be resolved, and enforcement and compliance is going to be a major undertaking. And how to do that correctly, how to improve the enforcement and compliance, we can learn from each other. One has to look upon states such as California as laboratories for what works, and see it. And I love this about in the paper presented in Leuven in January, the whole concept of policy pioneers. And I think California is very much a policy pioneer, and extremely important. Again, it's my own experience is why Japan followed California as the policy pioneer. Talk about this. The number of issues for which we have to make. There's going to be a new science advisory board report out from EPA very soon on reactive nitrogen. Talking about carbon, reactive nitrogen is up there on the list as well. And I'll quit very quickly. Again, I think the paper could be enhanced by mentioning where, for example, the federal government is lacking. California particularly has strengths, by pointing out that establishing links between European Union and staff in California has great value beyond just their meetings at professional and academic conferences. and again, emphasizing the importance of being able to measure progress.
Thank you, Andrew. The sign actually said 5 minutes, so
You maybe want to talk
not
about
5 seconds. So would you like to add, use one or two
Well,
minutes more?
the only other thing I wanted to add, the importance of informal relations. I work very closely in my work, even though I'm at EPA, I spend most of my time at the Department of Agriculture. And I spend most of my time at the Department of Agriculture because what I can do outside of USDA is what almost no one at USDA can do. You know, I can say things, I can do things. I can step outside boxes. Same things for this collaboration between the European Union and California and elsewhere, and step outside boxes. Years ago, when I had a German Marshall Fund fellowship relating with nitrogen in Europe, one of the statements made to me, I'll never forget, from the German government, was that we will help you on this issue if you help us. When we're not doing it, you criticize us. Shame works very well in motivating government. We will, and please, we want you to criticize us, and we will criticize you when we're not doing something. And at least I think it's a very important motivator for action. And I think that's part of what's going on, what Schwarzenegger is doing on climate change. Probably enough.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you made some very important points. Our second discussant is George Arbelian. Mr. Arbelian is with the San Francisco Global Trade Council, and he describes himself in the bio as a business leader with strong interest in global sustainable economic development, ocean restoration, and international policy challenges associated with these themes. And as you can read, he has a very extensive experience and activities as innovator in the business world around this theme. Please.
Thank you. I'm also in support of the paper and the directions this group is heading. And so my comments are going to be a little bit on the inspirational side. I'm starting with some quotes from the people that originally inhabited this land. If the white man wants to live in peace with the Indian, he can live in peace, treat all men alike, give them the same law, give them all an even chance to live and grow. All men were made by the same great spirit chief. They are all brothers. The earth is the mother of all people, and all people shall have equal rights upon it. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade, where I choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty. It's from Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. Will you teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother? What befalls the earth befalls all sons of the earth. This we know, the earth does not belong to man, man belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. It's from Chief Seattle. We now do crown you with the sacred emblem of the deer's antlers, the emblem of your lordship. You shall now become a mentor of the people of the 5 nations. The thickness of your skin shall be 7 spans, which is to say that you shall be proof against anger, offensive actions, and criticism. Your heart shall be filled with the peace and goodwill, and your mind filled with the yearning for the welfare of the people of the Confederacy. With endless patience, you shall carry out your duty, and your firmness shall be tempered with tenderness for your people. Neither anger nor fury shall find lodgment in your mind, and all your words and actions shall be marked with calm deliberation. In all of your deliberations in the Confederate Council, your efforts at lawmaking, in all your official acts, self-interest shall be cast into oblivion. Cast not over your shoulder behind you the warnings of the nephews and nieces should they chide you for any error or wrong you may do, but return to the way of the great law which is just and right. Look and listen for the welfare of the whole people, and have always in view not only the present but also the coming generations, even those whose faces are yet beneath the surface of the ground, the unborn of the future nation. I am honored to be part of this conference today. as it is part of the University of California, Washington Center. It is symbolic, because in the words of John Masefield, a university is a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. Let us appreciate education as the means of developing our greatest abilities, because in each of us there is a private hope and dream which, once fulfilled, can benefit all. We have been pushed together by the hands of fate in the decision-making center of one of the most powerful countries on planet Earth, to bring to the United States, the European Union, and the world the solutions that will lead humanity toward a sustainable future. Our challenge is to research and discover ourselves, and then to help others see. Trust is the foundation of hope, and my confidence in our ability to shape our future is equal to my respect for the challenge of giving a chance to the changes we must embrace to adopt the disruptive technologies that will shape our new world. How we do it becomes easier than can we do it. The best of humanity have given their lives to great ideas and noble ideals. While the world watches who is in the lead of the arms race, attention is diverted from slow death we are imposing on our future. Our collective wisdom must be focused not only on the solutions, but the social brace of getting others to see, of creating the political will to make the shifts and changes that will shape our collective destiny. As JFK said, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Before we take the first step on our journey together, let us consider two futures, one with solutions and one without. Let us think of how the children of the future will be affected by the decisions we make today together in this room. How do we do it? The Chinese use two brushstrokes to write the word crisis. One brushstroke stands for danger, the other for opportunity. In a crisis, be aware of the danger, but recognize the opportunity. As JFK also said, our problems are man-made, therefore they may be solved by man. And man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. We need people who can dream of things that never were. We need to recognize opportunities everywhere around us, bring common sense to uncommon situations, and simply make things happen. In that capacity, we must follow in the spirit of those who embrace the challenges of humanity's first global endeavor, transportation. These kindred souls who looked at vast expanses and did not shrink away from the enormity of traversing distant landscapes, wide seas, and the heavens themselves. Led by their wonder to explore and understand, these pioneers assembled man's greatest technological accomplishment to propel their dreams and navigate their imaginations, expanding their own horizons and in turn all mankind's to develop the sciences of astronomy, physics, chemistry, engineering, metallurgy, meteorology, oceanography, and medicine to achieve what would have been just 100 years ago thought of as impossible. Right now, at this very moment, planet Earth careens through space at some 67,000 miles per hour orbiting the sun. We as mankind, as nature, as Earth's passengers are collectively awakening to a vast horizon. We are looking at the clearest view, the best picture of our global condition ever witnessed by humans in history. We stand tall on the shoulders of those that have poured lifetimes into books and research that we now can instantly access on our computers. We no longer have to wonder. All we have to do is look. We no longer have to ponder. All we have to do is ask. What we face today is not the unknown that must be understood, but the known that must be acknowledged and decided. Transportation developed over centuries was tempered to work with nature as it evolved. In transportation, as in humanity, violence and destruction results from a failure of intelligence. Transportation brings together the best designs with cooperation on a global level. It is now time to take that same level of ingenuity and cooperation to key issues facing the global community. There are risks and costs to a program of action, but they are far less than the long-range risks and costs of comfortable inaction. Change is the law of life, and those who look only at the past or present are certain to miss the future. And in planning the future, just as in transportation, we have to decide on where we want to go before we can get there. What are our collective goals? Perhaps every child grows into the most beautiful adult he or she can become. Each child realizes his or her full potential. What do we need? Clean environment, air, water, food, loving family, comprehensive education, shelter. Where do we fall short? Business and government do not embrace their role in stewardship and consequently burden future generations with flawed infrastructure and planning. By the people and for the people is not only good government, it is good business. As populations grow exponentially, concurrent environmental degradation on all fronts simultaneously, forests, lakes, rivers, oceans, etc., destroy the very environment we depend on. Even though we are adaptable and control our environments to a level that allows us to live beyond our ecological niche, we remain part of the environment and subject to self-regulating systems of population control that are triggered during stress. Immune systems falter and potency, fertility decline, reducing both lifespans and birth rates until the environment restores itself. How do we succeed? Embrace positive developments across all sectors, tax incentives, governmental institutional awards, trade-ins, trade-ups to further better products. Pace humanity, use resources prudently, and as Buckminster Fuller said, technology will allow us to do more with less. Respect water. Buckminster Fuller also asked the question, why are we using a couple of gallons of clear water to get rid of half a pint of yellow? Indeed, his manufactured home was never allowed into the marketplace despite a stack of deposits for orders because the electrical and plumbing unions resisted and the banks wouldn't give mortgages for the new idea. There are plants in Holland cultivated over the past 30 years that have root systems that can purify even antibiotics and hormones from wastewater. Henry Ford knew the internal combustion engine had issues with noise, pollution, and safety. Gas has 15 times the explosive power of TNT. So Henry Ford and Thomas Edison started to build electric cars in the late 1800s. Edison's battery factory mysteriously burned down. General Motors' profits from building internal combustion engines for World War I allowed them to purchase and dismantle public transportation systems around the country and give birth to the problems of today. T. Boone Pickens has a Honda that runs on natural gas that he fills up at his home for the equivalent of $1 per gallon. The U.S. has some of the greatest reserves of natural gas in the world. Geothermic, HDR, hot dry rock, is also abundant in the U.S. The southwest U.S. is one of the richest geothermic resources in the world. Drilling technology well within current limits of use, no pushing the envelope required, exists to tap this source and provide clean energy for eternity. Open source ideas. This is survival time. Let's embrace, award, reward, and honor innovation. The government should test and develop innovation fleets that can then be developed for the commercial market. Many of our most reliable developments were created for and refined in the military, with the consumers benefiting from more reliable products. Resource pools. Foundations and philanthropists should partner with business to help develop green, cradle-to-cradle materials, products, and designs. It is the ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure approach, as we then save the resulting environmental damage that comes along with ill design. Healthcare should be prevention-based and the health of the environment considered and the health of the individuals that depend upon it. There are great opportunities in recognizing and collaborating on solutions that address our common interest and the means by which those solutions can be developed and deployed. Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or the present are certain to miss the future. The great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Belief in myths allows the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. To achieve our objectives, we now have at our disposal the second great global solution produced by humanity, the broadest reach of any communication and educational device in history, the Internet. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, man's first probe into outer space. In response, the embarrassed U.S. government under President Eisenhower initiated an aggressive military campaign to compete with and surpass the Soviet activities. creating the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. With the formation of NASA in 1958, the activities of ARPA moved away from the aeronautics and focused mainly on computer science and information processing. One of ARPA's goals was to connect mainframe computers at different universities around the country so that they would be able to communicate using a common language of protocol. For the first time in history, mankind has the capacity to engineer the future. The data and analytical capacity to look at vast variables and model the outcomes. We must look at education, government, business, investment, philanthropy, economic policy, and environment as one interconnected and interdependent global system. We must work together to sculpt the future with our highest ideals, for we now live in the age of thought. What we think today, we become tomorrow. Thank you. The children of the future are watching.
Thank you very much for this very inspirational comment on the paper. I must say, as an academic, I very much appreciate your uplifting view of universities and the researchers there, which somewhat contrast sometimes when I have to discuss with my dean and my department chair on some more down-to-earth issues. You mentioned that there's a challenge, there's also opportunities all the time. I'm actually going to put this in practice now, because since the challenge was that there was one less contributor discussing, that gives us some time to actually have some discussion with the people in the audience here. So I'm going to open the floor, give you the chance to ask questions or comments on the papers or on what has been said. Let me use my sitting here, just make one comment myself on the basically the paper by Bruce and Christina. So in terms of the role of California as an experimenter in regulation and in particularly in the importance of demonstration effects, okay? Just two small comments. One is, I was wondering when you were making, I think you made a convincing argument that the situation in California is not due to a flaky situation, but kind of to more structural factors. I just wonder whether it matters whether it's due to a flaky situation or structural factors. For example, if you think about the demonstration effect of the Iraq War, it doesn't really matter whether Bush stayed in power now or not, because I think the demonstration is quite clear what impact of the war could have been. So even if it's temporary situation, there may still be a very important demonstration effect of some policies. My second point related to that is, I think the impact in terms of depends very much on the relationship between the state government, I would guess, and the federal government. I mean, I've done quite a bit of research on some of these issues in the former Soviet Union and in China. And so a number of research, in particular, for example, Gérard Roland from the University of Berkeley, he claims that one of the factors of success of the Chinese development is particularly the fact that the Chinese federal government used the state governments to experiment. So they actually imposed the experimentation on some of the states, which of course implies a certain relationships between the state and the federal, which is very different than in the US today, where it's actually the initiatives come from the regions rather than the other way around, without much of a certainty that a successful experiment will be taken over by the national government. So I just want to give this as a comment.
Thank you.
Michael, there's questions here.
If you have a comment, please step up to one of the microphones so that this is being recorded. It will be recorded.
We'll use the other one. I think it's more for recording anyway.
Two good points. David?
Two points. I think first, the idea of experimentation, I think, has really become almost, when you have the main advantage of a federal system is experimentation. I think it's become almost enshrined in at least economic thought, the work of Tybert and all this element of local public finance. And I think that throughout the world, like if you look at Germany and other countries, the notion of experiment with one place or another, let's see if it works, is becoming a norm. So I really don't think that something that is unique, and I think that some principles that we should work on. Now, the other thing is, with respect to California, I think that the political economy of California is really unique. We don't really have historically a strong steel, coal industry that will be basically anti-environment. On the other hand, I think all the movie industry and all this tourist-based industry really emphasize environmental quality, and I think not only that California is beautiful, we made money out of it. Right. You know, you cannot make movies when you have smoke, and I think that's important. And the other thing that is now happening is Silicon Valley. And I really say that Silicon Valley has incredible arrogance. First they came with a computer, now they took over the telephone, and next they will take over the automobile. So deep inside, California doesn't mind to have tough regulation because Californians, they assume that the Midwestern wouldn't be able to do it, and we one day will take it over and do it better. So I think this type of deep arrogance inside, I have to admit it, is something behind what's going on today. We will have a new world order that will help us. And I think that what David Vogel a lot of times said, that tough regulation is a mechanism that help to people that are better or more equipped. I think this is something that is deep ingrained in the state, but we don't speak about it.
Very interesting. So I guess the concept of arrogance is interesting. I was just thinking about the same thing, wasn't it? Okay, I got at least 3 more comments here. I'm going to try to pick up all the comments and then give the floor back to Bruce and Christina. I first had Nick, and then over there, and then David. I think the mic is working as well now, but yeah.
At any rate, we need a super regulator to try.
Okay, well, good morning. My name is Nick Hanley, for those who don't know me. I am currently sort of a hybrid between California and Brussels as the EU visiting fellow, and I am from the Environment Department of the Commission. I, like other speakers, have very much appreciated the papers and liked in particular Christina's assessment, which I think is a very sound basis and puts some of the fears away. And clearly, California is a special place, and looking at California, I don't think there's any worry about the sustainability of this. When I look at some of the candidates for replacing Arnold Schwarzenegger, there's some fairly green people amongst them, so I think that isn't going to be the issue. I think the concerns that some of my colleagues in Brussels have about this is that because we are in a new environment where we have, for the first time for a long time, true environmental engagement in Washington, there is a concern that if we come too close to California with a memorandum of understanding like this, this would be seen in Washington as some kind of slur on Washington. And I think this is a part of the real politic we have to address. When we look at the climate debate, I have the feeling that, in fact, the people in Washington are quite pleased that California is pushing ahead because they can say to industry, if we can't do it at the federal level, we'll have a whole rush of California-type initiatives, and this will be a mess. So I suspect behind the scenes there's a lot of encouragement to California to go ahead, more to hold up the spectre of chaos in a whole variety of things. I would like to ask Andrew specifically a question. Since you are from the EPA, I don't know whether you're here with an official EPA hat on. Even if you're not, perhaps it would be useful to express to us how you would see it from the federal level. Would the federal level see such a relationship between California in the EU as a negative thing, or might they be prepared to give it formally or informally some kind of blessing? And that is an issue which I think is real and is something which might actually have some influence on the thinking of my colleagues in Brussels about whether to go in this particular direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Very nice comment and interesting question, please.
Good morning. I'm Tam Dodek, also with the California Environmental Protection Agency, specifically with the water group there. And I want to thank you for the paper. In my former life, I worked on a variety of MOUs, including MOUs with Canada, Korea, and Germany on environmental technology development and a transfer. And I know from that experience that, yes, you run a very high risk when there comes a change in administration in terms of continuing the efforts of these MOUs. However, the most successful MOU effort that I'm aware of, that I've been involved in, was, in my mind, successful because it included not just the governmental agencies and the bureaucracies that Joan didn't mention, but it also included universities, academia, and it also included, perhaps even most critically, the business community, the regulatory community. So when you have those entities all involved in an MOU, regardless of the administration, regardless of the bureaucracies, there is life beyond the political life, I guess, of an administration, because you have business who feel that they have invested in the process and there is something to be gained in terms of developing and furthering these operations. So a recommendation perhaps for future consideration in terms of MOUs is to expand this current focus on just government agencies and looking towards also the business community as well. Because I think you will find a great deal of participation and commitment into making an effort meaningful, implementable, and also sustainable.
Now, did you have those universities and businesses as signatories to the MOU? Or?
And the one successful one that I'm aware of, yes, they were signatories. And they made, especially the business community, made commitments, financial commitments. And so there was definitely ownership of the process, and they made sure it continued. And the MOU that I'm thinking of was signed during Pete Wilson's administration. So that was 3 administrations ago, and it's still very active today. It has to do with dairy quality assurance in California.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 more questions on the list, so I'm going to ask the people to be, I'm going to stop after these 2, because otherwise I won't have time. David, you had been asking.
very brief. I'm David Rolenholtz from UC Berkeley. I wanted to just mention two aspects of California's exceptionalism for you to consider that maybe have had less emphasis. In the popular discussion of California's environmental agenda, the first one that was actually mentioned by Andy, and that's agriculture. One of the primary reasons that California has pursued a sustained agenda for stewardship of natural resources has been the emphasis on product quality that's emerged in the agricultural sector. Product quality and value added are extremely important to California agriculture, especially its intensive crops. And the agriculture sector is now a very important stakeholder in environmental policy in the state. And I wonder if maybe the Europeans are taking full advantage of that constituency in their formulation of policies. The second one is more of a political issue, and I think there it's not clear how we translate this to European experience, but something very important about California in the environmental agenda has been the question of valuation of private property assets and the environmental value of private property assets. As most of you know, when our governor was elected last time, he had margins that most of his Republican colleagues could only dream about at the time. And one of the main reasons some people said was because he slouched to the left with his environmental policies and picked up all these progressive votes. There's a very important conservative constituency in the state which is tied to real estate. And the environmental value of those assets is enormous. Michael, my colleague, has done work on climate damage in California. I've done work on, just produced a report in November on the economic cost of climate damage in California, and the biggest category of assets at risk is real estate. There are about $4 trillion, even at today's prices, worth of private real estate in California, and about 60% of them are at risk over the next 2 generations from fire or water damage. So there's a very strong private economic interest in the environmental issue, and it's only going to become more intense as climate risk becomes more severe.
Okay, thank you very much. The final question?
Thank you. I haven't had the benefit of reading the paper, I'm afraid, and I do regret that at the moment. So the question might be covered in the paper. One of the other topics on your program is on impact assessment, and that's something that we're very familiar with over in Europe. And what I'd like to ask is, what other options were considered for promoting cooperation between EU-US or EU-US California, in addition to the Memorandum of Understanding? And was there consideration of a do-nothing option, simply because there is activity already? And also, is anybody able to give any feedback on the practical results of the Memorandum of Understanding between, for example, the United Kingdom and California? Because I know that exists, but I don't know if anybody can comment on that, or whether that's one of those which some people have said, has been symbolic, but not very productive.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a large group of comments and questions. I think some of them were merely comments, some of them were questions. I'm going to leave it up to Christina and to Bruce to pick, to respond in whatever way they would like. And also Andrew had a specific question directed to him. So, Christina?
Okay. I believe it was Mr. Hanley's comment about whether it's problematic at all for the EU to get closer to California, if that would be viewed as an insult by the federal government. And of course, I'll let you comment on it. But our take on it was that it wouldn't be. It would be more like saying to the federal government that we're going to cooperate with California. California will be sort of an example experiment, and then that the federal government could learn from. So not necessarily that it would be any sort of insult to cooperate or to get closer with California. What's your view on it?
Again, I can't possibly speak for the Obama administration. I've only had a few dealings so far, even with the political appointees. However, I've read an awful lot of the statements by the president, statements by, I know, our new administrator of EPA, Lisa Jackson. I also know something about her through when she was chief of staff for Governor Corzine in New Jersey, another very progressive state like California. Though a lot of people perhaps are not aware of how progressive it is, especially on environmental issues. It's how it's done. It can be done as a snub, or it can be done as in the spirit of cooperation and in broader cooperation, recognizing we have a very difficult path ahead, and we all need to work together. And I think the President has said this a number of times, the importance of respecting others, respecting other states, and being on it, recognizing on many of these issues we're on a level playing field, and sharing. So again, I would emphasize how it's done, not as a snub, but in the spirit of cooperation.
Well, I think in the past when this question about the effectiveness of MOUs has come up, Dan Policier was there to answer that question. I don't know whether Joan wants to say something, but he certainly believed that these things had an impact. But you know, it's funny because Hetty and I were talking yesterday. I think if you were thinking of the next valuable empirical project, it would be a systematic study with some indicators of not just MOUs generally, but which ones were more effective, so that you could say in retrospect when you go forward with an MOU, what are the conditions to make sure that they're successful? And that would be an extensive empirical study, but that would be valuable, I think, at this point, because there's enough of them now, including, and I didn't realize, going back to the Wilson, that shows my ignorance about it, but there's obviously a very extensive history which would make it possible to sort of begin to figure out whether it's the conditions of how they're written and presented, which I think is obviously the point about the spirit or the framework of it, or whether it's it's about the particular subject matter or the involvement of third parties. I mean, we've had a bunch of theories about what makes it go forward with despite changes in administration, and I think it would be a useful study to try to figure that out, to give guidance in the future, and even if it's not absolute certainty about whether an MOU will survive, it would at least give some guidance about best practices and making something that just doesn't get dismissed.
Okay, great. Let me end them by thanking our speakers, our discussants, and certainly all the comments from the audience, which I think were very, very useful, and we're perfect on schedule.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's all right. That's the way I normally keep them.
And Nebraska said, fine, we need to learn from the Indians as to what we are doing and the Europeans vice versa as to what can we learn from a state that actually wants to move forward with the rest of the United States. And I know that was done through NATO organization.
When was this done?
This was back in the late 80s. And my suspicion is that there have been a number of these relationships. Hold on, I thought EU was state Nebraska, and the answer that I got from the Europeans is that they're moving in, why not work?
Right. Well, that's useful. I'd also, as the Obama administration gets more serious about environmental regulation, we'd like to have you back as a speaker for the Americans. We do a Monday night forum, and we get things that move down the cycle.
Always in the state of California.
So you went to school in Chicago?
No.
Oh, okay, great. Hi.
I could figure out which of his many places you were at.
How's everything going so far?
Good so far.
That's someone else's. Well, actually, that one's loaded, so we can take it. I can recapture it.
So I'm going to watch how this is done so that
You know how to do it.
Yes, and so I'll be here all day.
You are in very good hands. You know myself and other conversations.
Yes.
But if there is a question, give Yandy a call. Give you his
Okay.
Okay, where are we?
Okay, it's
Maybe
pretty.
should be a lot of, oh, here, over here. Let's see, it's under pesticide. Okay, and it's this one. These are the-
50. I love technology.
It's amazing.
It's-
This is fancy.
Yeah.
You want this at IGS?
Yes, I do. And are you guys updated up to that PowerPoint 2007 window? That's the issue I've been dealing with. I hope no one has that. That's the issue I've been dealing with at IDS lately.
So now, do I use that or do I use that?
There you go.
Okay. That's forward, that's backward. So let's see. Forward, backward. Okay.
You're a natural.
That's why I have a PhD, so I can learn to use it.
Cued right there, easy talk.
Where am I? Okay. Okay. I guess we could just put it up. Yeah. Since they're-
Conference related. I'll qualify it.
Lack of sensitivity to our European brothers.
You're right, yeah. It's interesting when we write each other. It's often hard to put an umlaut in, so he spells it J-O-E. You know, there's an O kind of ring that go together. Yes. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Chris, hands up.
Wally B. Woodowski. Nice to meet you. And Nicholas Wally B. I'm going from my notes. Yeah.
I have mine set.
My speech teacher would be proud of me.
You're going except radio.
Yes, that's right. My speech teacher, professor, would be here. He'd think, oh, that's good to hear. You got it right. There you go. There you go. Speak up. Be calm.
Really? Way back in the
old days.
You just speak to
yeah, let's think. Let's see. I think I'll pick one woman and one man.
Stop.
He's really kind.
Were you in economics or agriculture?
I had the best professor in the world in communication. I mean, he was, oh yeah, speech, my speech. Yeah, that was a required class. And everybody had to get an A.
I guess that's what they think they do. They've actually expanded.
You kept taking the test until you got every question right. He said, I'm not trying to trick you. I want you to know these things. And if you don't get right, it's okay.
Well, they had culture. We had the agricultural society. One of the things that we were required to take
So we're going to get started. Do I need this mic? Does it work? I tend to have I tend to use my outside voice sometimes, which my wife reminds me of on occasion, especially in the theater. I wanted to thank you for inviting me and David to invite me to participate in the meeting today. I'm David Vodovsky. All bios are in here, so I won't give you a whole spiel about my background, but I do want to say that I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I direct the National Center for Environmental Innovation. And before I took on my current job about 3 years ago, I was the chief of the Economic Analysis Branch in the Office of Pesticide Programs at EPA. So I have quite a deep, enduring interest in this topic, so I'm very excited to be able to chair and to some degree MC the event today. But real cast of characters is over to my right, so we'll get to them in just a moment. Sorry, but didn't push you off, Chris. I also was mentioning to Chris that I am a UC Berkeley alumnus. I graduated with a degree in political economy of natural resources, which was a wonderful opportunity to take a cross-disciplinary approach to tee up understanding real-world problems that gave me a perspective then as I went on to graduate school and kind of learn some of the tools to solve those real-world challenges. And the reason I mention that in addition to claiming some affinity with this building, with the campus, is that the topics that we're going to talk about, that you're talking about today, and certainly that Chris is going to be introducing in his paper, have to do with the confluence and the intersection of politics, economics, natural resource, and protecting public health. And for me, that's a very exciting topic. I think it's a challenging topic, particularly when we're talking about things like persistent organic pollutants or POPs and endocrine disrupting chemicals. There is a very complex set of regulatory, there are complex sets of regulatory issues that combine and knot up concepts of politics, concepts of economics, and natural resources and protecting human health. And unraveling that Gordian knot is no easy task. And so I was very glad to read the paper that Chris had written and is going to be presenting today that tries to start to unravel that and understand the system, the categories, and the way we can conceptualize governance around these different kind of topics and how politics, economics, and natural resources all are part of the system, but we also, in order to manage them in a national, transnational sense, it requires us to think systematically and carefully about how these systems fit together if we want to make some progress. It's a great challenge, but as it's been said, with every great challenge lies a great opportunity. We'll have an opportunity to hear Chris, who's a associate professor in political science at Berkeley. As we know, the bio's in here, we can read all about that. We are also lucky to have three distinguished panelists who will be discussing Chris's paper. Joan Denton is with the California Environmental Protection Agency. She's the director of the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. Wally Baker is the president of the Green Tech Foundation. And Mr. Nicholas Hanley is, I believe, the head of the Nature and Biodiversity Unit at the Environment Directorate in the European Commission. So we're going to have time for a presentation of Chris, about 30 minutes. We'll have, expecting up to 15 minutes or so of discussion, and we're hoping to also have some time, as every session, have questions and answers at the end. So in order to leave time for those questions and answers, I'm going to stop talking and turn the podium over to Chris to present his paper. So thank you.
And I'm going to stand up, I think, if that's okay. Okay, well, good morning. It's still morning, I think, isn't it? And I guess I would start by just saying I'm in awe of the cast of discussants here. It's just really impressive. I wish they had written the paper and I could be their discussant, but alas, I have to actually stand up here and give the paper. So first thing I want to say is that my co-author here, my better half, is Jörg Bolsiger, who's from the Swiss Institute, Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And the division of labor was broadly that he did a bit more of the European stuff, and I did a bit more of the American stuff. So just that's a kind of to tell you that I may have to refer to him, even though he's not here. We should have had him on speakerphone or something. Okay. A little bit of background on the paper. I think, as was described this morning, there's a history to this project. It started out as a kind of California-EU comparison, and with this paper, it really started out as an examination of pesticide policy. So there was an early incarnation just focusing on pesticide policy. But one of the things, as we moved on in the project, we decided we're going to focus on biodiversity and biosafety. And so I began to look at pesticide programs, which are very interesting and complex in and of themselves. But as I began to look at them, I said, what can we pull out from these pesticide programs that are really kind of a critical discussion about biosafety and biodiversity? And out of the original paper on pesticides, we talked a little bit about endocrine disruptors and persistent organic pollutants and kind of said, there's a lot of interesting things going on here. We need to look more carefully at that. So in the more recent version of the paper, we focused on these two specific classes of chemicals: persistent organic pollutants, or POPs is the acronym, and endocrine disrupting chemicals. Since that's a long term, I'm just going to abbreviate it EDCs, okay, just to make it easier as I go along the talk. So now one of the consequences of refocusing the paper is that it took us away from pesticide programs, because what we immediately learned is that although there's a lot of discussion in the literature on pesticide regulation about POPs and EDCs, it turns out that that the legal frameworks and strategies for dealing with these kinds of chemicals are much, much broader. So as we shifted, we sort of lost a little bit of the focus on the original pesticide stuff as we focused on these two classes of chemicals. But it's still there to some degree, and I think if you read the paper there, you see that there's a hidden kind of lineage back to discussing pesticide programs. Okay, now just a quick thing to say. These are classes of chemicals, and I just say about, in terms of pesticides, not all pesticides, many pesticides are POPs or EDCs, but not all of them, and vice versa. Not all POPs and EDCs are pesticides. So this is the way in which they cut across a number of different kinds of chemicals, not just pesticides. Okay, let me go to my first slide. Did that work? And let me just tell you a little bit more about these two kinds of chemicals, which some of you, I'm sure, know about, and others may not. POPs have a number of characteristics. Actually, more than this in some treatments, but the kind of minimal characteristics for a persistent organic pollutant is that it's persistent, meaning it doesn't decay very quickly in the environment. So once it gets out there in the environment, it doesn't go away. It's bioaccumulative. You've heard about food chain effects. So to be bioaccumulative means that these things get further up in the food chain. When you get to the tuna, the mercury has accumulated because it's eating all the smaller fish, which eat the plankton, et cetera, et cetera. So they're bioaccumulative. And finally, the reason why we're concerned about them ultimately is that they're toxic. Now you'll see I kind of highlighted PBT because, just to make it more complicated, another acronym that you often see, took me a while to figure this out, for POPs is PBTs. So if you look at EPA programs, for instance, they don't talk about POPs, they talk about PBTs. So that's just, you'll hear me refer at various times to both these. Okay, a little bit maybe more straightforward, endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs. Basically, what that means is that these are chemicals that disrupt hormonal systems. This is not very good if you know a little bit about hormonal systems, especially if you have teenagers. You know that they are very important. They send all the chemical messages to help you develop correctly. They also send chemical messages that allow your body to function correctly. So endocrine disrupting chemicals are things that disrupt this hormonal system, this chemical messenger system, and in doing that they can potentially cause consequences for human and animal health. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is that these, and part of the reason I got fascinated with them as we started this project, is that they really pose very fundamental problems, challenges, let's say, for regulators. They have specific properties that make them difficult to regulate, make just the task of thinking about regulation difficult, I think. And so there's a kind of a standard way that we often think about chemical pollution. We think about setting certain maximum thresholds or setting standards for how much you can release in the environment. And that is problematic for both these two kinds of classes of chemicals for a couple reasons. Okay, well, for POPs, they are persistent and bioaccumulative, which means that you can put small amounts into the environment and they can accumulate and they can be magnified in the food chain. So that makes it just difficult to decide what's the amount you can safely put out there, which is what a lot of the regulatory logic for dealing with chemicals is. You set kind of a standard or a threshold for how much is possible to safely put into the environment. So that makes this difficult. Okay. Second thing is that for both POPs and EDCs, and I suppose this is just true of everything, but we don't have enough good scientific understanding of how they move through the environment, and also a lot of discussion of EDCs in particular, how they interact with other chemicals. So just the science is poor on this. You can imagine with POPs, understanding how they move through the environment is quite important. One of the things that other characteristics people sometimes mention about POPs is that there's a kind of a long-range transport aspect to them. So once they get into the environment, they can move either by the air or by the water long distances. And that's one of the reasons, as we'll come back and you'll see there's a lot of activity at the international level on POPs, and I think it's partly driven by this long-range transport aspect. Okay. As I said, the technology of regulating chemicals there's a kind of a basic underlying logic to that, and it's based on the idea of dose-response curves and an assumption about dose-response effects, I should say, that they're linear. So in other words, you put more of this nasty stuff in the environment, and the result is you'll get worse effects. Well, for EDCs in particular, and this really creates a lot of difficulty in thinking about how to regulate them, they don't always follow this kind of linear response curve. That is, the more you put in the environment, the worse the effect is. For some EDCs, people have found that they actually have their effect at very, very low doses, and when you put more into the environment, it may actually, the effect might not be the same. Okay, this doesn't mean I think that we should put more into the environment, but it does mean that setting the proper standards becomes very difficult if there are these nonlinear dose-response effects. So that's, all these are really saying that the job of regulating these two classes of chemicals is particularly difficult. Okay, now in the paper, I have we introduce a theoretical concept. I don't even know if it deserves that title, but we call it regulatory circuits. The name of the paper uses this. And I'm just going to really briefly, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I just want to say just a few words about it because I feel compelled to do so because it's in the paper. This is really a kind of a reflection of the academic interest we have in this issue, because I mean, as academics, I think what we're interested in trying to understand is how how regulatory developments occur in the first place. We're less sometimes interested in the actual policy implications. We're interested in explaining why things happen. So in light of that, we're often, in studying regulation, we're often interested in how certain regulatory developments come about. And there's a lot of literature on this. I should say, first off, that I think that this concept in our paper is underspecified, but we were trying to do something that I think is still quite legitimate, and that's we're trying to develop a synthetic concept. And so this regulatory circuits idea became our way to synthesize a lot of discussions in the literature about these regulatory influences. Okay, if you look at the literatures, and I just not going to go into them in any detail, but I'll just briefly mention them. There's a number of literatures that talk about how regulatory developments occur. And they all have something a little bit different to say. So, David mentioned this morning the issue of trading up versus races to the bottom. And California Effects is kind of a political economy literature on regulation, and that you probably have heard quite a bit about. There's a literature that you may know less about called multi-level governance, and it argues that there are very interesting things happen when sometimes through interest groups, the developments at one level of government are used as leverage to influence the developments of regulation at other levels of government. And this can be quite complicated multi-level effects. Venue shopping is a classic political science literature. It basically says interest groups are going to seek out the venues, the forums, regulatory forums or arenas where they're going to have the most influence and where they can get their ideas across. And that means they're going to be shopping around, looking at different levels, that's kind of a conventional political science discussion. Something we've talked about in this project, policy learning or policy borrowing. You see this a lot. One jurisdiction sees that another jurisdiction, another state or country is doing interesting things, and they kind of model the programs on those successful programs. And finally, there's a literature on international regimes that makes a number of interesting claims. It says basically when you create laws at the international level, they start to have reinforcing effects on each other. When you create international secretariats to carry out laws, they often become advocates for those laws. And what's my point there? There was a lost it. So the point I want to make about the regulatory circuits idea is just that we found all these things happening with persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disrupting chemicals. And we said, oh my God, there's all these different arenas. There's all these effects. We need to synthesize it. So we came up with this idea of regulatory circuits, which just really just says that all these effects are happening in a kind of a complex circuitry of interaction. And we haven't specified that very well in the paper, but it's a way of bringing all these things together. So that's the purpose of that. Okay, now what I want to do is now look at, very briefly and selectively, look at some of the regulatory programs that have developed in the U.S., California, the EU, and at the international level. You'll see very quickly that it's a pretty complex multi-level process, I think. So you'll see some of the circuitry, although I won't call much attention to it. So let me start with the U.S. Now, in the U.S., there are multiple laws and programs that deal with POPs and EDCs. There's TSCA at the top, FIFRA, the Pesticide Law, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, FDCA, and those I would say are the main laws that deal with this, these issues, although you could certainly find others. And I just want to start with TSCA. And somebody, Linda, where are you? We talked to you. You said that there is some discussion that TSCA may actually be eventually revised within the next few years. So this is an interesting and important development. Basically, theoretically, I think you would think that TSCA should be the most important U.S. law legal framework for dealing with POPs and EDCs. It is, after all, our main law for dealing specifically with toxics. But in fact, it's been generally seen as a pretty weak law. And just to give you a sense of that, there's a lot you could say about that, but I'll just say, give you one indicator of that. At the international level, there is something I'll talk about later called the Stockholm Convention. The Stockholm Convention identified 12 nasty POPs. They're called the Dirty Dozen. I'll come back and I'll show you those later. Those 12 chemicals, one of them is prohibited under TSCA. 9 of them are regulated under FIFRA, or prohibited under FIFRA. 5 of them under the Clean Water Act. No, I'm sorry, 3 of them under the Clean Water Act and 5 of them under the Clean Air Act. So you get a kind of an idea. FIFRA is much more important for regulating POPs than is TSCA, and there's a lot of interesting reasons for that. But they have to do with the structure of the program and the kind of difficulties that it has in regulating toxics. Okay, now I'm not going to go into each of those legal frameworks, although there's a lot to say. But what I want to do is come back and look specifically at a few of the programs focused on POPs and endocrine disrupting chemicals. I'd first say down at the bottom, I don't know if you can see, EPA has what's called, and here you see the different acronym, a PBT chemical program. And this is really not a regulatory program, as I understand it. It's essentially a coordinating program. It's EPA's attempt to coordinate across all these other regulatory laws. So it's a coordinating program, although not unimportant for that reason. Now, it basically has so far, as I understand it, focused on 15 chemicals. And this includes the 12 chemicals that I'll talk about. I'll come back and I'll show you what they are from the Stockholm Convention, the Dirty Dozen, which are mostly regulated under, as you can see, under various legal frameworks. And then 3 others. And the way that EPA's PBT chemicals program works has a lot of moving parts, but probably I'd say that the main thing it does is it tries to create a national plan for each of these critical chemicals. So it has 15 chemicals, trying to create a national plan to coordinate across all these different legal frameworks. And to give you an idea of the level of development of the program, they have draft national plans for most, though not all, I think, of these 15 chemicals. They're in some kind of draft form. And they've published final national plans for 2 chemicals, mercury, which is a big one, and alkyl lead. So that gives you kind of an idea of where this program is. Okay, and just quickly say, beyond this PBT program, there's the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, RCRA, has its own, again, I'll stress, voluntary program working with industry to minimize waste. And to do this, they've done something interesting. They've developed a list of PBTs. Again, PBT is the same thing as a POP. And on that list they've come up with 53 chemicals which are important PBTs or POPs. I use these numbers just to give you kind of a very rough idea that, you know, here we're talking about 15 chemicals, 12 at the international level, 1 regulated under TSCA, but the RCRA program has identified 53 chemicals of concern. So there's a lot of play here in terms of how these chemicals get defined. Okay. Oh dear. Okay. I thought I was way ahead. Okay. I will speed up. Oh, let me say one other thing. This is actually important. So under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, their EPA also has a specific program for screening and prioritizing endocrine disrupting chemicals. It's called the Endocrine Disruptor Screening Program. And the thing I want to say about this goes back to my point about the way that these are difficult to regulate. This has really been, essentially this is a pre-regulatory program. It's to identify the EDCs of importance. And it's really been quite a daunting research and analysis task, I think. There really is a massive number of chemicals that you could potentially screen. I've heard estimates of 87,000 or more. New chemicals are coming onto the market all the time. Some are becoming obsolete, but it's a huge, huge job, and they have trouble even figuring out how to prioritize which chemicals they screen. So the progress has been, they've made real progress, I would say, but progress has been slow, and probably slower than we like if we're concerned about these EDCs. So I'll come back because there's an important comparison with the European case. Okay, now let me talk about California, and because I'm going to not say much about California, but here would be some of my points. Joan is going to maybe say a little bit more about the California case. But I want to just make 2 points about California. First, California has been very progressive on chemical regulation, and often the explanation of that, this is another thing to add Bruce's argument, the reason they've been progressive is often, people often point to the weakness of TSCA. So TSCA is weak, so California has stepped in to try to remedy that. And the other point I want to make, it's down at the bottom, is that on chemical regulation, the EU is now having a lot of influence on California. We have what's called the Green Chemistry Initiative, which I think Joan will mention as well, which is really influenced, or not exactly modeled on, but influenced by the European Union program called REACH. And this has led to some interesting legislative developments. And second, California has followed the EU in banning a couple of specific chemicals. I believe these are both EDC, viewed as EDCs, brominated flame retardant, the stuff you spray when you go to put out a fire, has this nasty stuff in it, nasty flame retardant. And also several phthalates, which are in consumer products and most problematically in toys. So it's banned, both of these, and this was pretty much, you can just see it as following, they followed the ban that occurred in Europe. Okay, now let me move on to the EU. And the EU, you could basically talk about all the specific laws at the EU level, like TOSC, RICRA, et cetera, but I won't do that. I just point out a few of the general highlights focusing on POPs and EDCs. In 1999, well, let me first start at the top. The EU has been very, very supportive, probably the most important supporter of the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. And in 2007, it has ratified that treaty. 2007, it laid out a very comprehensive strategy for implementing its treaty obligations under that convention. In 1999, notice a year after the EPA program, it set up a strategy for dealing with endocrine disruptors. And what's kind of interesting about that, it's also, I think, had a lot of trouble getting that program up and off the ground. Give you an idea of numbers. It's conducted 3 major studies of endocrine disruptors, really just to screen which ones it thinks are important. So again, it's at the same stage as the EPA paper. And out of that, those 3 studies, they screen basically 553 chemicals. If you go back to my number of 87,000, you can kind of see that there's some important discrepancies there, or gaps there. Okay, many people have heard of the REACH program, and I won't say much about that, except that now under the REACH program, POPs and EDCs can be designated as substances of very high concern, so they can be regulated under this powerful new chemical regulation program. And I want to note, Hetty made sure to remind me of this, that the EU Parliament has passed a new pesticides law, which makes specific provisions to try to phase out both POPs and EDCs. Now, I haven't been able to follow up, but this was passed in January, and I think it went to the Council for approval. People thought that it wouldn't be any trouble, but I haven't heard the final. Maybe Nicholas can tell us the final verdict on that. Okay. Okay, I will try to work quick. The international level, I will just say that there are 3 big conventions, 3 big treaties. Most important, in my opinion, at least for POPs, is the Stockholm Convention, which I already mentioned. It was signed in 2001 and came into effect in 2003. The EU is a big supporter, and this is the dirty dozen of chemicals that it's prohibited, and it also has a provision to add new chemicals, which is an important issue. There's 2 other important conventions. I won't say anything about them. The point I want to make is that this has really created an international regime for chemicals management, these 3 conventions. And just to give you an indication of that, people see them as very compatible and reinforcing. They use some of the same language. The EU proposed to try to combine these under one global chemical convention. The U.S. didn't support that, and it hasn't gone anywhere. But that gives you kind of an idea of how this was important, that these 3 work together in some fashion. Okay, let me turn to policy options. And the first one is just so kind of obvious that I feel embarrassed even kind of saying it, and I don't know what effect it would have come from me anyway, but I guess you can't, it's kind of the elephant in the room. That's that the U.S. should ratify the Stockholm Convention and these other 2 conventions as well. So just to give you a background, the U.S. was a signatory on all 3 conventions. It hasn't ratified any of them. And it turns out that this, I think, is bad for the international community to get these programs to be taken seriously, but it's also bad in a way for U.S. interests, I think. Next week, the Stockholm Convention meets, to take up the EU's proposal to add 9 new chemicals to the Stockholm Convention. The U.S., as not having ratified the Stockholm Convention, can be there as an observer, but doesn't have voting rights, so its influence on these issues is quite limited. Okay, it'd be interesting to hear, I've heard some arguments about why it's not ratified, but it'd be interesting maybe to hear more about that. Second is maybe a kind of more technical issue. It goes back to this point that on EDCs, both EPA and the European Union are in pretty early stages of pre-regulatory development, I guess I would say, of EDC policy. And they're really, as I say, it's really a daunting task. So any cooperation, increased cooperation between the EU and the U.S., I think would really be helpful to move this forward. It's gone very slowly on both sides. And it turns out there already is cooperation between the EU and the U.S. on this. And it takes place within the context of a very good program put together by the OECD called the Endocrine Disruptor Training and Assessment Program, which was started in 1996. And so there has been cooperation, but I think it would really help both sides if that cooperation was expanded. Okay, and last point. And this last point is a policy option that really comes out of our thinking about how these different regulatory arenas interact in this circuitry fashion. Because when you think about that, it starts to tell you have to be kind of conscious of what the parallel developments are in these multiple regulatory arenas and how they're influencing each other. And this kind of leads you to think, the timing of these changes are really important. So what's going on in these different arenas is not independent of each other, but you could even be more strategic, I think, about pushing forward. And if you wanted to upgrade some standards, and here I guess I'm speaking to the EU colleagues, if you were interested in upgrading standards on certain chemicals and you wanted to focus on chemicals, I think you could focus on how the developments are occurring in parallel across California, the EU, and the U.S., and how that leads to a kind of momentum for upgrading on certain standards. So I just used the example of endosulfan in the paper. It's already been banned in the EU in 2005, although it took till 2008 for it to survive a court challenge. This is one of the chemicals they proposed, one of the 9 they've proposed to the Stockholm Convention. Now, there's a lot of things happening in the EU, the U.S. and California as well. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed a ban in 2002. The EPA, in a report in 2007, determined that endosulfan was indeed a POP. And in 2008, Environmental Scientific Coalition came together and petitioned EPA to ban endosulfan, which is, by the way, a pesticide, so it kind of brings me full circle. And finally, at the California level, and this is, I think, maybe Joan can talk about this if she'd like, there's been a draft risk assessment. I believe your office is responsible for this, is that? You'll tell it. And it has advised, it's a draft report, but it's advised that California ought to designate endosulfan a toxic air contaminant. So the idea here is just that by focusing strategically on what's happening across these multiple arenas, at the same time, you could strategically think about how to upgrade standards on particular chemicals. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thanks for a great presentation, Chris. You certainly laid out a lot of the challenges for us to think about, and when we talk about multiple levels of governance, here's one of our very important levels at the state level. Joan will tell us a little bit about, make some comments from the perspective of California regulatory program.
Thank you very much. My experience, my professional experience for many years has involved chemicals and chemicals management. And so that's the perspective that I bring today from a state program and bringing the perspective of this paper. Some of the programs that Chris mentioned in his paper we have direct influence or direct authority over. And I just want to mention them quickly because I will be talking about them again in a couple of minutes. We have been directly involved with the development of toxic air contaminant and air quality standards. We implement Proposition 65, which was one of the initiatives that was talked about earlier that requires individuals or companies or manufacturers who expose individuals to chemicals in California to let them know. They don't have to do anything about it, but you have to let them know. It's been an extremely effective program. So our department implements that. We've been very involved with biomonitoring that Chris mentioned. Green chemistry is another area that we are really strongly engaged with. And another area is in the cumulative impact of precautionary approach project, which the California Environmental Protection Agency has instigated. Also, we work closely with the legislature on bills on chemicals which are considered either providing technical assistance or providing the administration with an approach for how to weigh in on the program. And also we do have a role, although our primary role is not what DPR, which you mentioned here, we do have a role in pesticides. So you can see that we do have experience in these various areas. And so it's from that kind of background and from those perspectives in the paper that I want to address my comments. When I talked to Hetty several weeks ago, I said, okay, Hetty, what do you want out of us? What do you want out of me as far as commenter on this paper? And she basically said, we'd like for you to address what are the strengths of the papers, what are the paper, and what are the weaknesses of the paper, and also what you think about the policy recommendations. And since you're in the throes of getting together your next grant proposal, if you have any additional policy options and recommendations. So with that in mind, that's how I've crafted my comments, and that's what I'll be remarking about over the next couple of minutes. Okay, so I'd like to first of all say what I think the strengths of the paper. I think the strengths, I have three strengths. I think one is that it does provide in one place a description of the EU, the federal government, and California's approach to the EDCs and POPs. So it's kind of one kind of area where you can go to see what all these individuals, I mean, it's sort of, everything swirls around these classes of chemicals. And so I think it's interesting and unique in that perspective. It also talks a little bit about these classes of chemicals, and if you look at and sort of looking at some of the background information to this paper, it is interesting that so much emphasis of these three areas, California and EU, the federal government, is involved with EDCs and POPs. So it's timely. It's very timely, and it seems to be a real area where there's a lot of focus. The third thing is I think it does describe a reasonable framework for understanding these very complex and complicated programs, whether it be and they all sort of evolve, how they evolve, and what they involve, and what they control, and who's involved, and where it seems to be going. So I do think that it provides an interesting sort of a framework by which to understand this whole rather very complex area. So those are what I think are kind of the strengths of the paper. The weaknesses of the paper, I think the paper, I found it kind of difficult to read. And I think it deals with the complexity of the issue, but it's difficult. I had to read it several times before I really got what it was about. And so I think it would benefit, first of all, by some graphics. When you talk about circuits or these, you think of visual things. So I think it would benefit by circles or something by which you could graphically describe to a sort of visually what it is that's involved here. So I think the paper would benefit from that. I think it would also help to use examples. And the paper describes these circuits of regulation in the beginning, but then I think you need to carry it through. And so I just wanted to take a minute because I took the opportunity to think in terms of what you were talking about specifically for California. And Chris talks about there are three different areas. There's institutionalization, there's mature and emerging programs, and then there's hybridization. So if I, having had a lot of time in California with the California Chemicals Management Program, if you look at institutionalization, I go back into the 80s, and here's where you had the clear separation of risk assessment and risk management. You have scientists such as myself and those who work for me describing in toxicological terms using animal and human studies what are the effects of individual chemicals. So you document their effects, you have all kinds of public outreach, public input, and then you have a regulatory program which seeks to manage those, separate from risk assessment and risk management. You also have the development of the hotspot program where industries which emitted those chemicals and have to report the risk assessments. That's another area of chemicals management. And you have then the Proposition 65 program. That was all in the 60s. Sorry, that was in the 80s, where you had people were very concerned about exposures to toxics. Therefore, we want to know what we're being exposed to, and we want you to tell us what you're exposed to. Those are now institutionalized. And when something becomes institutionalized, it becomes mature. And my observation, which I'm sure your observation is too, that when programs become mature, they slow down. So you have very rapidly evolving programs initially, and then they slow down. And they slow down because a lot of the things have been set up, and procedures have been set up, and process have been set up, and expectations have been set up, and so then you're really slowing down. In fact, we have a major lawsuit on our hands right now because of the speed or lack of in our Proposition 65 program. So I mean, I think as you get older, and when you're young, you're vibrant and energetic, and then as you get older, you slow down. Well, it's just typical of chemical programs, and that's what we're observing in these chemical programs. So those are sort of the institutionalized programs, and that also feeds into the mature program. So the second element is framework, and with the mature and then the emerging program. So I won't talk about the mature because I kind of talked about that in the institutionalized. But what about the emerging programs? Okay, what I've observed is over time people are getting more and more not nervous as much as they're impatient with the slowness of a traditional program. Animal studies are now becoming more and more difficult, more and more expensive to conduct. Human studies take an extremely long amount of time. So the traditional way in which we looked at chemicals is becoming sort of unsatisfactory. And over the last 10, 15 years, I think this is evolving now, while you see, not only in the EU, but in California, this impatience is resulting in chemical bans. People are no longer wanting, policymakers are no longer wanting, the general public is no longer satisfied with waiting with very lengthy types of assessments in order to know, and very lengthy types of risk management to sort of get something out. If it's, you've seen, I don't know if you've seen, but I've, in my experience, seen that, the trespass is the harm. It's no longer the high risk is the harm or the risk is the harm. It's like the trespass. If I'm being exposed, then I consider it to be a harm. And that's why we're seeing the evolution of these bans. And in California, as Chris mentioned and is mentioned in the paper, California banned certain types of flame retardants. Flame retardants bioaccumulate. And also phthalates in children's toys, and that's also evolved, I think, to the federal government, where there's also that is happening. And right now in the legislature, our legislature, it has not been passed yet, are bans on bisphenol A, which is a endocrine disruptor, in children's food containers, and also looking at a complete ban of flame retardants. So the bans continue. It was the uncomfortableness of totally banning something that I think brought much to bear on the development of this green chemistry initiative, which is a key element, key initiative that we're right in the throes as an emerging program in California. And this green chemistry initiative is quite broad. My department's responsibility is to develop a clearinghouse of information by which we are to determine what hazard traits and what toxicological endpoints will be part of characterizing individual chemicals. And that will inform consumers, manufacturers, reducers of chemicals, what they're being exposed to, but also what are the alternatives, which is another very important feature as we move to other chemicals. I think another thing's happening as far as emerging programs is because of the difficulty with animal and human testing, you're seeing science. The science aspect of toxicology is going more towards genomics and these biomics, different kinds of utilizing very, what are called high throughput assays. How are we going to be able to look at toxicity of chemicals in a very rapid way? And that, if you attend the Society of Toxicology meeting, then you can see that there's a lot of information, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of interest going into high throughput assays. How are we going to really look at risk, which we developed in these animal studies or controlled human studies? How are we going to do that with these high throughput? So it's a very, very challenging aspect. And that is all evolving. It's all an emergent program. The final and the third part that he talked about was hybridization. And, in hybridization, I think that there is this tension on the one side of wanting to take action on chemicals, again, kind of the precautionary approach, before you know what the evidence is. But then on the other side, there is so much investment and resources that go into commerce as we know it, to ban chemicals just outright without a consideration of alternatives or without a consideration of the cost, really, really does impact long-term investment and uncertainty for businesses. So that's kind of where I see the hybridization in California sort of working itself out. We still have ban bills, but on the other hand, we have the Green Chemistry Initiative. So so that's sort of on the way, and I'll finish here quickly. I think that there are some specific sort of weaknesses to the paper that I won't go into detail here. I mentioned to Chris earlier that I did send it out not only to the department, I sent the paper out to some of my colleagues, and I probably have 5 or 6 responses of those colleagues that I can provide to him. But there are little details. For example, the problem with POPs are that they aren't really known if they're that toxic. We know that they bioaccumulate and are persistent, but the toxicity is uncertain. It's not really clear. And if they were known to be highly toxic, then they would already have been dealt with in another program. That's the issue. They don't really know the toxicity. But it's those kinds of things that I think would improve the paper on the details. So I want to just turn finally to what I see as additional policy or recommendations. I'm an administrator, so I look for specificity and I look for measurable results. So when I look at this paper, I think there could be recommendations that on programs and on coordination that could be tracked, because I go back to this saying that what doesn't get tracked doesn't get done. So I think keeping this in mind, and I think that was said in the earlier panel, of something being tracked is important here. I think with the new administration there's a great window of opportunity. We have an MOU that we recently signed with our counterparts at US EPA to better improve our communications, and that's kind of a new thing, because under the previous administration we were not so proactive in doing this. But in some, I've thought of 3 different areas of potential interaction that could be tracked. One is in this whole clearinghouse thing. If the federal government has all these databases, the EU is developing all this information, and this clearinghouse that we are in the throes of developing, and we are working with the EU, certain elements of the REIT community, to really focus on there being a central clearinghouse. Is every entity going to be able to have the same kind of chemicals management policy? The answer is no. It's not going to happen. But the information database could be very critical in the evolution of the policies for these 3 groups. Another area that I think could be important would be to develop common definitions. For example, endocrine disrupting chemicals. Although it would seem to be a simple definition, there are multiple definitions. And to even have a common definition, to arrive at a common definition of things such as endocrine disruptive chemicals and persistent organic pollutants, I think could be a step forward. Just a simple common definition. And then the third area, and one that I'm personally very interested in, and that is, I think, a lot of the driving of chemicals management deals with exposure. How much and to what are individuals exposed to? The CDC has an active program on biomonitoring. California just recently passed legislation and some limited resources to develop a biomonitoring program specifically for exposures in California. And I think working with the EU on something as a program such as biomonitoring, so not at the specific chemical by chemical, but just basically by exposure, could be a powerful addition to a chemicals management program. So those are my 3 suggestions as far as policy options.
Thank you, Jen. Great suggestions. Wally.
Thank you. I'll just run through, my comments are some of them are similar to John's, and I say them in different ways, but I'd like to go through that, and then I'd kind of like to back up and kind of give you a little bit of perspective here, because I think the partnership between California and the European Union and EPA is probably what's going to make a number of programs, including this information about chemicals, really come together. I think the paper did lay things out pretty thoroughly. I thought that the concept of circuits of regulation was a great concept. Circuit board, and then circuit board put into series. I thought all that kind of made sense. I thought the overview and all of that was very comprehensive. It's a very complicated subject, especially for a simple country boy as myself. But I thought the step-by-step was pretty good there. I thought you went through that in the way you needed to, and the comparison and contrast. I do think the flow readability was a challenge, because I always had to stop a lot and kind of back up a little bit. But again, the subject matter, pretty difficult to come across in anything but a more structured, formal way. I really felt like a matrix or a table would have helped me. And I would even add into that, I would like to have seen some kind of management aspect of it addressed, so that I sort of understand, what you see. You have these circuits, you have all this. Now, how do you see this being managed better, or how do you see the interrelationships of the 3 different geographic areas? For me, that would have been but I focus a lot on the applied side of things. When I look at California, and I look at the sort of the past of environmentalism and stuff, I look at it in like 3 pieces. I look at it as individual environmentalism. The people, Teddy Roosevelt, so on and so, these were individual environmentalists. That to me is where things started. And certainly that has evolved, I believe, and I think the Clean Air Act kind of triggered this to what I would kind of call now a green staff environmentalist. So we've kind of created this shadow enforcement, shadow organization of non-NGOs. And I sort of say environmentalism for quite some time has been driven more by a staff approach, lawsuits and so forth. I think that has made a tremendous difference. The effort going forward, I believe, is going to be much more of a consumerism type of environmentalism. And I see that when you look at greenhouse gas. Now, really, do people understand that? No, I don't think they really do. But they want to know more about that. They're taking that individually on, and I think the thing that has made it a rallying cry is the consumerization of it, and that everybody feels like they can have a perspective and it's something that can add value. When we look at chemicals, I think the problem we have there is it's hard to visualize this. We have been very successful in California in the past and in the present because I believe people, consumers, everyday people can understand clean air. They don't, they can see it and it's not clean, and they can figure out, oh, gee, I'm doing this every few seconds. This could be bad, so they really connect to that. And that, I believe, is one of the strengths, and I think that's going to be the absolute challenge for POPs and EDCs. I think getting it to a level where people can identify and understand what you're talking about, I think that's a very important thing. Without that, and this sort of ties into the perception of California, without that perception, I think it's very difficult to get the cooperation. I believe AB 32, helped go down that road. I think linked to others is a very important element right now, and the EU and EPA linkage with California, I think, is a pretty important effort to make, whether that be with chemicals or whether that be with low carbon fuel standards or cap and trade or whatever. I think ultimately, and so let me kind of say to you where I think the future of this is going. I think EPA for sure, have some additional information, but I believe they definitely are going to use California as sort of their delivery system. And they can't, frankly, deliver things very quickly. And quickly is like years. It takes them much longer to get things done. So being nimble and being responsive to consumers in the marketplace, gives California a very big role. There's some downsides to that, but I believe that's absolutely where we're going to go. I do think we're heading toward consumerism. I do believe we have a governor now who believes in an environmental legacy. He's had some trouble holding that together with all the budget and the economy. And maybe for the first time, I was in a meeting, because I'm involved in goods movement in Southern California for 10 years. And I was in a group of meetings where we're talking about the container fee, and the first words out of the environmental community's mouth was, oh gosh, the economy's bad, we got to be careful. So there is suddenly, I had never heard that as being the first thing in the discussion. So that's kind of telling me that this is a big challenge. The economy is going to play a role. I think in the future, what we all have to go for, because I don't think it'll work otherwise, is more of a self-confident regulation than an arrogant regulation process. And I think that, historically, we've had an arrogant regulation process. Then we thought, well, we'll just eliminate it. Well, that doesn't work either. So, to me, what's a self-confident regulation process? It sort of means business, community, everybody has to get together and work and make this happen. And then you have some self-confidence. This regulation is actually going to change things and improve things. I think, in European Union, you're seeing, there's resistance. But, you're trying to get self-confident regulation, which I admire. I think that's really good. In California, we haven't always done it that way. We kind of laid down the gauntlet and said, here's where we're going to go. But we're seeing, like the automobile waiver, I don't think we still have done that. And I'm really not expecting California to get that waiver. I think they're realizing, one, the economy, two, the auto industry is going to come around, and we can live with that. That's the whole point of the waiver. So I'm still, that was a good example, I think, of self-confident regulation. I think the low carbon fuel standard is brilliant because it gets at the source of the next process. However, it is treacherous. I mean, in the economy we have, it is really easy to screw up a market. I mean, it is really easy to do that. So while this is a really brilliant approach, it's going to take a lot of nurturing in California. And, the other side of it is, on the governance side, I would be willing to bet almost anybody in this room our next governor is Jerry Brown. So, and the reason is he's very popular. His ARB, his Air Resources Board chair, was Mary Nichols. That's who it is right now. Oh, that's interesting. So, there's a possibility there that may continue. But, I know Governor Brown, and he is a really interesting person, but a lot of perspectives have changed from his first time to his current time. Then I would just say to you, one of the challenges here, to me, this, in the partnership, the Constitution is a problem. And California has found this out. This is part of how we're operating. See, the Constitution was put together in the United States when there were only 13 colonies. Most of them were small. But New York, Pennsylvania, some of these people scared Rhode Island, so they thought, well, we can have a House of Representatives. but we have to have a Senate. and we got to make sure the little guy wins. We can't goof up the little guy. This will always, I think, pretty consistently give California some problems. We will see on issues of the environment, we still won't see the 60-40 like you would see. I think you're going to see the Constitution itself be sort of a problem. The Senate does have the authority to ratify things and hasn't done that. So I think you're right. You got to go about working together with the European Union in a way that doesn't snub the Senate, doesn't snub that, but gets together. I would just say in that regard, whenever I do a project, the second thing after mission is guiding principles. And that gets you right at what is the meaning of this, what are we trying to do here, how are we trying to do that maybe. Then you can do goals and objectives. So I think your guiding principles are going to be very, very important. And I think we're going to see California, more so than ever, I think has certain fear of isolation. I think there's a concern that we can go out and make these suggestions and programs, but if EPA isn't with us and the European Union isn't there, I think they're concerned about that. I hear this. You know, this is one of the fears I hear is isolation. And that's how I interpret that. And it sounds kind of negative, but on the other side of it, you know, they just don't want to be the Lone Ranger anymore, I think. You know, I think they want to partner. So that's a strength, but I think that it's a big concern. I think we have been the scout more than the pioneer. And remember, the scout gets cut off from the hunting party. I mean, you got to be careful when you're a scout, right? And I think we're kind of looking, how do we kind of get back to the cavalry phase, you know, the pioneer phase? And I think the economy, again, is driving that. And, you know, we just generally will have some structural issues, but I do believe California needs a partnership with the EU, and I think it needs it with EPA. I think there's mutual benefit. It is all about how you go about doing that. In terms of going forward in California, I think one of the things I'm concerned about is what is a green job? What is that? You know, if you work in a factory and they make efficient appliances, is that a green job? You know, what's the meaning of that? And then how do we even keep track of it? We don't even know. The federal part of our government and the state, we keep cutting back on the data. Yeah, we keep cutting back on the data. So bottom line is that I think there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of challenges out there, but I think in the end we should be able to craft some relationship that helps us with the chemical issues and a lot of other issues between California and the European Union and the United States.
Great comments, thank you. And bring in our European partner, Nicholas, please.
Thank you very much. I read the paper with interest, and I think I share the views of other respondents that it's a good analysis, but a rather complex one. But then the problems and issues here are rather complex, and I think the concept that maybe some graphics here would help us find our way through. As I looked at it, and it's not my particular area of specialization, I identified one or two other aspects, certainly from the EU context, which are not there. The interface between the water legislation, for example, is missing, and there's been a lot of discussion on water quality issues about pesticide levels, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought I would start actually my presentation by telling you a little story. It always helps, I find. When I was early in January in Brussels in the freezing cold, queuing up to get my visa to come into this beautiful country of yours, I was told to arrive early because there'd be a long queue, and it was a very cold January. So after queuing in the snow for half an hour, my level of warmth feeling to US collaboration was not at its highest. I then waited for about 3/4 of an hour in my turn to come up to the counter to answer the questions which were being put to me so I could have a visa. Who's paying this? Are you going to be able to support yourself? A lot of fairly aggressive questions which I would have preferred to have answered in the intimacy of your room, not on a counter with 50 people behind me. One member of your State Department, the Vice Consul, whatever, then said to me, and I get to the point of the story now, I see you're from DG Environment, but you can have your visa when the EU lets in hormone beef. And I said, interesting, can I quote you on that? And then he sort of withdrew. That brought home to me the sensitivity of the issues that we're playing with here. Clearly, I know this is history now. Maybe this man was taking his byline from the past administration. That question signified to me a fundamental difference between you and us, as it was then, and it sums up in the words precautionary principle. And maybe in this paper it might have been useful to have understood that framework of the history, because history does have an effect on where we go in future. Clearly we are and have been for many years in the community implementing the precautionary principle, and it is one of the ground rocks of our environmental legislation spelled out in the treaty and the articles in the treaty relating to the environment. And it's interesting, and I read with great interest some work done by some people in this room looking at the evolution of chemicals policy, the way in which you in the US have moved from the precautionary principle quite sharply away from it as the EU embraced it. And clearly the history, the rather sordid history of the last 10 years of the REACH legislation and various involvements of the US administration to influence the processes within Europe have a grounding in this. I think it's important that some of the misunderstandings are overcome. Clearly, reference has been made to the pesticides legislation. I have a presentation here. I can share it, and Hedy could share it with all you. It wasn't just about banning substances. It was also about issues of responsible use. So there is clearly a reinforcement of what goes on the market, but there is, in the Framework Directive, issues about training people's use, methods of delivery, machineries directive is reviewed as well. So I think a lot of the concern I've felt in talking to people in the US about chemical control, it seemed to be ban, non-ban, whereas in fact quite a lot of what the REACH legislation is about understanding the risks and managing them appropriately, and it's not just ban, non-ban. I think therefore the general recommendations in this paper are good. I think, as my colleague from the EPA has said, could be refined a little bit more. I felt, and I say this as an individual rather than an EU official, that you've been a little bit timid, because when you've spelt out the complexity, maybe there is an issue about whether or not the US might consider joining with the EU and saying possibly we should move away from excessive complexity and try and pull this together. Maybe a new US administration might be more interested in some regularization, some simplification of the International Chemicals Framework legislation, so that it wouldn't require as complex paper like this to describe it, but actually a circuit of simplification. I think certainly science has to drive this process, but we have to balance, as I say, the science with the precaution. Over-precaution can take you down dangerous grounds. It's very reassuring to know that the OECD has been playing a role, but it's rather strange that it's the OECD playing a role. And I think the cooperation which is there at the moment between the US and the EU on a scientific basis is maybe a good platform for building on further in the future. So that's where I will limit my comments. I think you've made some good recommendations. Clearly, for the US to sign up to the Stockholm Convention is a sort of almost the first obligatory step to move forward. It will give them legitimacy in the debate and maybe help as a basis for moving forward a more collaborative process in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. And I have played the overbearing timekeeper so that we could make sure that we had time for questions or comments from all of you participants. We've given you an awful lot to think about, obviously, enjoy and digest as we head into lunch. But I do want to take a few moments and a few minutes if people have comments, questions, and certainly give also Chris a chance to respond to some of the things that he's heard. Please.
I'll leap to Jerry Zakundi from the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance. I will leap to the assumption that not all of these chemicals are going to be banned and that we're going to be dealing with them for some time. And I also will leap to the assumption that many of them are going to end up in our water streams. And even with primary, secondary, and tertiary treatment, we still have these EDCs. My question is there any technology that's on the table being developed that we're going to be able to utilize, because we want to be able to recycle a lot of this water for use?
No, I don't know.
Actually, no. The Department of Water and Power in LA, this is a huge problem. Pharmaceuticals. I mean, it's just like unbelievable problem, and they still have not figured out how to deal with that. Yeah.
And I can tell you, at least from a perspective of some of the work that's going on at the U.S. EPA in our Office of Water, and then some of the technology support that we're giving, is that there's work going on from the National Science Foundation that EPA is also supporting to look at methods of filtration. But as well as pharmaceuticals and water is a huge priority for us. But some of these things don't lend themselves easily to filtration or removal. Some of them can be energy intensive. Some of them are just very difficult to manage. David, did you have a? Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
My name Dmitry Novik. I represent myself, and I, to some extent, from another planet.
Mm-hmm.
I customer of agriculture products, but I'm not specialist in agriculture. But my question is general: why I came to this conference? Because it's managing biosafety, and and when I came here, I don't see any reflection of biosafety of nuclear power plants. You know, the basic opposition for nuclear power plants is biosafety. It's dangerous, very dangerous. Why this phenomenon, this question, have not discussed if you try to manage biosafety? Because you cannot ignore nuclear power plants. It's the same as to ignore globalization.
I'm going to leave that to Hedy or to David. I thank you for the comment, Dmitry. That's I mean, it's an important question. It's certainly not the topic on the table for this particular panel, but maybe one of our organizers would respond to that.
Question. I was working for many years with OECD on trying to develop some sort of convention, and I think that if there was one emphasis, it was on moving away from banning to mechanism of restricted use and increased precision. Basically, and to some extent, I think that one way that both the EU and California can work together, because we are really about, to me, a green economy is about precision, getting the maximum with minimum damage, rather than about blunt, unsophisticated tools that are appropriate for totalitarian regimes. So emphasizing banning will be really bad. Now, the other thing, when we look at California and the pesticide, I think the biggest achievement that California had was the fact that we start automatic registration of pesticide, developing a database in a computer. And I think if there is one thing that basically we led the nation basically kicking and screaming, and I hope that the EU will do the same thing, and I hope that it will be globally, is to develop a situation where we can monitor every pesticide. So to some extent, a lot of time when we look at the minutiae, we have to look at what are the guiding principles. And the thing, principle number one, we need to know what's going on with cell phone. What happened in California, it revolutionized California agriculture, because everyone needs to report what pesticides they use. And that was the most important thing that California did. Secondly, I think we really have to think in terms of being very, very well defined and using a policy that allow to use pesticides when they are needed, but make the incentive not to use them otherwise, rather than yes, no. That's my view.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just respond to that. I mean, the package which was passed in January had 4 elements to it. One was on the placing on the market, which is the yes-no. But a second element was framework directive on use, which looked at all of the issues you picked up on in terms of delivery mechanisms, training, safety, whatever. The third element is a regulation on collecting statistics, particularly there. And the fourth element was a revision of a machineries directive, which requires certain maintenance standards, restricts certain types of delivery mechanisms. For example, aerial spraying is now prohibited other than for exceptional cases where you have to motivated irrigation. So I think our package on pesticides was not just a yes-no package. It was the full strategy with all of the different elements in it. But as I say, there's a presentation here and you're welcome to have it, and there's references to a website afterwards for further details on different aspects. Thank you.
You make a good point of it about the importance of information technology and precision. In addition to managing the information about things like pesticide use databases, the computational methods for things like computational biology and computational toxicology, which may provide an insight into managing some of the challenges that Joan raised with the impatience of the public for some of the testing procedures that may require a long time that you may ameliorate with the precision computational methodologies. Yes, please.
Hi, Tam Dodek again with the California Water Board. I wanted to provide some information based on a question that Jerry Secundi asked. The Water Board in February adopted a statewide water recycling policy, and one of the things that we were very concerned with is another acronym for you, CECs, Constituents of Emerging Concerns. And what we did in the policy was designated, well, we're going to form a CEC advisory panel, and actually I was just in Costa Mesa on Tuesday for sort of the initial discussions about that. The workshop on Tuesday in Costa Mesa was put together by SQUIRP, Southern California Coastal Water Research Project. And they invited scientists, regulators, and to come together to discuss the issue of CECs. What do we do with them? How do we monitor them? What treatment methodologies are available? And this is hopefully something that will feed into the advisory panel that the Water Board is forming. The charge that we gave to our staff is to convene this panel by next month, next month is May, yes, and then to give the panel 1 year to have public deliberations and come back to us with sets of recommendations in terms of looking at CECs, where do we go from here, how do we monitor for them. And one of the things that I think is very promising is the idea of bio-objective, looking at things not from a chemical-specific manner, because let's face it, it's probably unrealistic for us to look at CECs, the breadth and diversity of CECs on a chemical-specific process and try to regulate them. So one of the things that we're encouraging this panel to look at is the idea of looking at things from a biological effect perspective, looking at organisms, looking at the biological effect on organism, determining then what causes those those effects, and then tracking it backwards, if you will, to constituents of concerns. But that's one idea that we want this panel to explore and bring back to the board within a year. Their recommendations on what approach do we take, what methods do we use, what information gaps are there that we need to explore, and what technology efficiency or technology needs that there are in terms of addressing CECs, as we call them. And the board also committed in our policy that within the panel would report to us within a year, and then within 3 months, I believe, within 3 months of receipt of that report, the board would hold. The board actually, in cooperation with the Department of Public Health in California, would conduct a public hearing to take input and then provide the next steps in terms of where we go with respect to CECs. So another acronym for you, CECs.
All right, we'll have time for one more before you give Chris the last word. Think about it.
Hold it. I'm Linda Shiro. I'm with the Congressional Research Service. I'm here to speak for Congress. I don't really. I work for Congress, and I do have a little different perspective. I'm the person who's responsible for giving them advice on the Toxic Substances Control Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, and how to regulate chemicals in commerce in general. I do that from the standpoint of the way that EPA regulates them. I'm not the overall expert in that area. I just wanted to make a comment. First of all, you asked about whether or not there are ways to regulate or to remove endocrine disruptors from water. there's a great deal of awareness about this issue, particularly here, because there were a lot of feminized male fish found in the Potomac River last year, which upset a lot of congressmen and senators and congresswomen.
Yes.
Yeah. We've been reassuring everyone ever since that the fish exposure to these things in water is much, much greater than the exposure of people who get their drinking water. Only the fish are breathing sort of the water, eating the water, drinking the water, living in the water. They're surrounded by the water. They're getting humongous doses of anything that might be in there, and in some cases concentrating it. In general, the fish that are affected are downstream of the outfalls from wastewater treatment plants. We don't know for sure yet what causes that. There's some talk about pesticides and some about simple birth control pills and hormone replacement therapy. But that issue is a huge issue. It's not only about endocrine disruptors, it's also Prozac and all the other chemicals that people take that go through your body and then go through the waste treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant. Anyway, Congress is aware of it. There's actually several bills out there to deal with it. One of them deals with the take-back programs for unused pharmaceuticals. That's a very complicated issue because it involves the Drug Enforcement Agency, because they don't want people creating piles of unused chemicals that are then available to misuse and abuse. And finally, I wanted to mention that the failure of the Senate to ratify, first of all, yes, technically, eventually, it is the Senate that ratifies. However, the Senate cannot and will not ratify unless it is consistent with U.S. law. We have been working for at least 4 years trying to develop the changes that are necessary to both TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, and the insecticide laws that would make it possible for EPA then to enforce those treaties. In the United States, we do not sign a treaty and ratify it unless we are going to enforce it. This is in contrast to many other countries, some of which I won't name. Anyway, we are working on it, and it's very complicated because if you open up the Toxic Substance Control Act, that's not the only thing that's going to get changed. It's a very big issue. There are lots of very fundamental issues that Congress has to deal with before we'll be able to ratify that or any of those other treaties. So that's all I have to say. If you want to talk about any particular issues over lunch, I'll stay for lunch.
Thank you, Linda, for your contributions. And Chris, would you like to have the last word?
I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for the good comments. I don't have any particular responses, but I am curious to ask you a question and know what the EPA, so I want to give you the last word.
Well, I guess I'll join Linda over lunch, and we'll be there to talk to folks about it. As Linda says, I mean, these are complex laws that are not that are negotiated through intense processes on the Capitol Hill with a wide range of stakeholders, with co-regulators like our delegated our co-regulators at the state level, and contemplating opening them up, or in some ways it does become a Pandora's box, and it's not just opening them up for the purposes of ratifying international treaties, but trying to harmonize them, update them from the time they were first, the legislation was first passed. And POSCA is one of those authorizing statutes that some people believe is long overdue for an overhaul. And so there's a lot of coordination that has to occur in those areas, but I think what you do see is a lot of active effort to manage our responsibilities in managing biosafety within the context of these laws, and also looking in a lot of cases to our state co-regulators to help lead the way in taking innovative approaches that then become, as you said, Chris, sometimes the lever, not just the lever down, the lever up in multiple levels of governance. So that's I don't know if that's not a complete answer. Nick has something to mention as well.
When I hear about the water quality issues in Washington, I note that there's one American who is applying precautionary principles.
And with that,
phthalates.
That's right. Let's thank our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good chairing.
Because it was so much just about the in the EDCs.
Right. They're probably, it's a big cycle there, right?
I mean, this issue of hormone efficient in the US.
Yeah.
And it has been driving.
Thank you very much.
Because everything is sitting limits requirements you're looking at that drive it legislation necessary. Because you say we don't want to be able to measure more than export a million of these substances. Therefore, you have to say, well, you've got to track it back through this.
Because we manage consumers do.
Because everybody's concerned about and your point
So we do hope to do some more interviewing in California and Washington. So.